Over the next 3 hours, I'll be interviewing Dr. Ben Joffe about his experience with spastic cerebral palsy. It is a longer interview, however, it is expansive and rich and insightful, and hopefully will be of great use to anyone with CP or the family members and friends of someone with CP. My intention is that the discussion at the end of this episode, where we talk about what a useful Yoga Nidra could look like, will result in a tool that anyone with CP can use to create long-lasting and profound relaxation in their body and mind. So that'll be uploaded in a few days. Please look for it and use it as much as you like. Thank you again to Dr. Ben Joffe, and enjoy the interview. Right, so I'm going to read a quick disclaimer at the top of this episode. I am not a medical doctor. In no way am I representing myself as having professional medical opinions that listeners should follow. What we discuss here today is an individual story for educational or information purposes and does not substitute seeking professional medical advice. I am in no way representing practices or results as replicable or scientific. Always seek professional medical advice and ensure that you receive proper treatment for all physiological and psychological symptoms and conditions. Okay, disclaimer done. Right. So, Dr. Ben Joffe, I'm going to just refer to you as Benny in this. I'm not going to, I can't. But in this interview, I'm going to be asking you some questions about your cerebral palsy. But before that, I would like to just introduce you and give a bit of insight into who you are, at least through my eyes. So, you have been on a lot of podcasts, and whether you or the host do the introduction on who you are, it is always very focused on your work and your interests. I'm figuring, hang on. But I would really love to take this opportunity to introduce you as a person who is a friend and as a person with cerebral palsy. So, it's entirely boring to Ben, I think, that almost everyone always starts describing him as really smart. His absolute worst is if you say he's really interesting. Of course, those things are true, but luckily Ben has other interests in himself. It does warrant being said. Some people walk into a room nose first, and Ben probably psychically projects himself into the room, and then if he chooses, he will allow his body to materialize. And by that, I mean, before you even decide if you're going to go to a place, you've already mapped out what the scenario will look like, probably with extreme accuracy, and then you decide if you will or won't go. Ben is kind and generous as a friend, and he gives enormous care to the lives and general well being of others. He is not very mysterious, although there is still hope. Ben is talkative. His superpower is being able to hold court in a room full of strangers. While that may be an annoying trait in someone else, in Ben it is wonderful. He claims English is the only language that he is fluent in, but he is fairly adept in Tibetan, French, Afrikaans, and increasingly Portuguese, as well as being able to understand or read some Arabic, Hebrew, Isiklosa, and Latin. Ben sounds a bit like Trent Reznor when he sings. A fact appreciated by a few audiences in Cape Town in the 2000s when he was the frontman of a band called the Gupler Effect. Ben is a lefty through and through. He is a queer left-handed tantric practitioner with a penchant for the occult. He's also a Gemini sun and has a love for staying at home, wondering if he should have gone out. He takes forever to get ready. He can lie still for an ungodly amount of time and takes morbid pride in his ability to exist within hot, airless rooms. Ben is a seeker. From childhood, he pursued the esoteric, finally falling into the anthropology trap where one studies a culture and ends up adopting the religious practice. In Ben's case, it is Tibetan Buddhism. Ben got his PhD from Colorado University and is one of my it is one of my life achievements to have been mentioned in the thank you notes of his thesis. Ben's father was a local celebrity in our home country. His father was South Africa's answer to Richard Simmons. Throughout the 90s, he woke up South Africans with his morning aerobics show Body Beat. Thank you, Dr. Ben Joffe. Finally, Ben is highly regarded in his field of research, having done his PhD thesis in Tibetan Nakbas and spent the last 3 decades engaged in various occult practices from tarot to ritual magic. He also works full-time for a Tibetan Lama as a translator within the Nyingma tradition. Both professionally and in his personal life, a key part of his day-to-day experiences frequently goes unmentioned. Ben has spastic cerebral palsy, and it affects his coordination, balance, muscle tone, psyche, and nervous system. And that's why today I want to talk to you about your CP, your experience of it, and ideally I can gain some insight into what Yoga Nidra could do to cure it, not to cure it, obviously, but to help in some way. So it's obvious at this point that you and I are friends, probably even distant cousins, and have been for almost 20 years. Of course, I've heard you speak about your experience with CP and about CP in general, about cultural awareness of CP, and I've witnessed you struggle with your spasticity as it comes as day to day hanging out. So when I wrote these questions, I really tried to remove the knowledge I have and step back in order to allow for a larger picture to come forward. Ben, I'm assuming you would like to correct at least one or two of these things from my intro. I have a feeling that it may be that you think you don't know Trent Reznor when
I
you sing.
actually have very little to correct there.
Really?
I mean, what a generous introduction. My gosh. Um, Thank you. Uh, the only thing, I mean, if you're seeking a correction, the way that you spoke about it, the anthropological track, it sounded a little bit like it's inevitable that when somebody is an anthropologist studying a religious tradition, they will eventually convert to that tradition. And that's actually not the norm. Anthropologists call that going native. It's kind of like a slightly jokey way of putting it. You have to go native methodologically. You have to put yourself into the experience of practitioners of that system or livers in that world. But often you're actually kind of frowned upon if you do cross the boundary. If you're not just doing that for methodological reasons, and you actually do become a convert. But a lot of people do. So um, that's all I have for you.
I'm really I'm shocked. Not even to say that you think you are mysterious.
Uh, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. I think
Yeah.
I'm chronically over available in key ways, sharing too much information, you know, leading with too much information, but then other people tell me I'm inscrutable and remote. So, eye of
Oh
the
yeah.
beholder.
Yeah. Yeah. The backstory here is that you and I were we were WhatsApp voice noting each other a few years ago, and we agreed that we would have better success in life if we were more mysterious and we didn't tell everyone every minute detail that crosses our mind and our life experiences. And you were going out with some mutual friends that night and you said, I'm going to be really mysterious tonight. And then as a result, you texted all of the friends that you were going to hang out with and you're like, in case you think I'm weird, I'm planning on being mysterious tonight. And and then immediately the jig was up. There's no hope. Like, and I've never related to you more.
Yeah, 100%. But I mean, it does point to, in talking about the CP, which we're going to get into, like, I mean, people don't know me. I spend large amounts of time being very quiet and silent, but it's never in the company of other people. So
Mm,
I often tell people, no, I have a lot of capacity to be quiet. I enjoy being quiet, but they don't believe me because they're never present for that.
yeah.
I suppose few people talk constantly when they're by themselves. But so it's not that weird that I'm not talking when I'm alone.
No,
But
no.
yeah, I mean, people just, I believe it is a part of the signature profile of spastic cerebral palsy to be talkative. I have
Mm,
yet to meet someone with my condition who doesn't have really afflicted vocal cords who isn't like full of hot air. I think that is
Mm.
actually a quality of cerebral palsy. It's hard for me to disentangle that from my personality, So, um, yeah, people couldn't, they wouldn't have been able to handle it. Like me being quiet all night. The famous instances of that, like it really derailed people. One Halloween, I made a commitment to not talk the whole night, and it really, really disturbed people. Okay, granted, I was painted. My whole body was painted, and I was in a terrifying costume. But still, like me not talking is a horror movie potentially.
Did you achieve your commitment and you didn't speak the whole night?
I did, yeah.
Wow.
Except when giving a dire prophecy to a stranger.
Oh, did they ask for it or were you compelled?
um, I can't remember. I think people had asked me if I wanted to do readings, but I didn't have my tarot cards with me. And as I said, I was half naked. My whole body was painted, wearing a wig. But I did actually once or twice give some
Yeah.
dire prophetic utterances in people's ears.
Amazing. Right. So, let's dive in. The first question is perhaps the best place to start, which is going to give insight into your CP and just the various very, very, very early developmental experiences that you had. So early, in fact, that it's literally about your birth, maybe even if it's relevant pre-birth. So the question is, can you please give an outline of your birth, the first few months of your life, and as that leads generally into your CP as it affects you now?
Sure. CP is pretty much essentially cerebral palsy is essentially a neonatal condition. So you don't develop CP. Uh, it usually happens at birth, just prior to birth, during birth is usually the situation, or right afterwards. The reason I'm kind of being ambiguous about that is because we don't entirely know. Um, it might also be that there's a range of conditions or factors that lead to somebody then exhibiting the symptoms of CP. At the outset, I should say that CP is like a very big umbrella term. Um, it includes many different kinds of uh, just coordination, neuromuscular problems. Um, I have the most common variety of cerebral palsy, the subcategory of cerebral palsy called spastic cerebral palsy, which means characterized by spasticity. Cerebral palsy, in addition to being an umbrella term, is also quite a strange term. It's actually a very old-fashioned word in a way. Palsy is most people don't even remember what the word palsy even means. It's like Old English. Palsy means like any kind of weakness or affliction in the muscle, and then cerebral means connected with the brain. So it's like the term itself has a kind of like lack of precision, like medical precision. It's an older word. And then spasticity is mostly just pointing to the symptomatic expression. So right at the outset, you can see that the name for this thing is it's very imprecise. It's very vague. And then um, how someone ends up having CP, it's not like you can say, okay, these things happened, or these genes are present, and now you have this condition which is always going to express itself with this degree of severity or these symptoms. It's just not like that. So there's, like I said, there's other forms of CP. Um, Let me see if I remember the terms correctly. Ataxic CP is characterized more by like ataxia, like there's more shaking, there's coordination. It's the wobbly CP. And then you have dyskinetic CP where the muscles might also be spastic, but then dyskinetic means that there's no ability to hold the muscles. There's sudden releasing of muscle control. And then there's varieties. Everyone can exhibit uh, some of all of those types in their own unique combination. And broadly speaking, increasingly now toward the present, we know there's specific areas of the brain that correlate with these types of expressions of cerebral palsy. So, like this sort of top motor coordination part of the brain is the one most affected when spastic CP happens. Um, I was never given brain scans. Nobody ever determined or diagnosed my CP as a result of identifying specific signs in the brain. To the best of my knowledge, that was never done. And I think now it might sometimes be done, but it usually isn't necessary. Um, CP is very circumstantial. So there's usually difficult conditions or problems around the birth. So in my case, I was born about just under 3 months premature. My birth was unexpected. It was an emergency cesarean birth, and it was traumatic. My mother, I'm my mother's second child of two, and she was an extremely healthy woman, very committed to exercise, doing just the right amount of like healthy living and exercise as a pregnant woman. She'd had a relatively uneventful birth with my sister. My sister was actually she was about a month late. Um, my mom was just kind of waiting for her to, you know, get out of there. And yeah, and then my mom got very sick out of nowhere. She got, I think, a respiratory infection. um, I think she got bronchitis or pneumonia. I'm forgetting now. And then she actually had a variety of infections. And then what happened was the infection infected her amniotic fluid. And of course, that's like major alarm bells. So they didn't want to, they had to do a cesarean. They had to get me out of there. I could have died in the womb. We don't know exactly where when the damage to the brain was, because that's essentially what CP entails. Somehow, at some point, the child in the womb or coming out of the womb experiences quite serious and basically irreparable damage to parts of the brain. So I often joke to my friends, like, I'm the only like medically brain damaged person like, or whatever. People don't often associate you associate brain damage with lack of other kinds of functions, sometimes colloquially, like, are you brain dead? And I'm like, well, I actually am. There are portions of my brain that were damaged. Now, it could have been during the cesarean. It could have been as a result of how my mother's sickness affected me in the womb. Um, my mom has a pet theory, just as luck would have it, bad luck would have it, about, it was very touch and go. They didn't know if I would live. It was 1986 when I was born. Medical technology was a lot less developed than it is today. So I was in an incubator for a very extended period of time. I was fed through feeding tubes from birth. Um,
Can you share how many months were you when you were born?
So I forget the number in weeks, but it was just shy of 3 months premature. So I was 6 months uh, old. Humans are interesting because the last 3 months in gestation are really just like zhuzhing. Most of the development has been, the major organ development has been done. But a baby that's that premature usually they really just don't know the what the state of the baby is going to be. You're very small. You haven't really been bulked up. The lungs are often very weak. So, um, in my case, I was also born with a variety of infections. So, at birth, I had pneumonia. Um, I had whooping cough. So there were a lot of things that they had to monitor. And in an instance like that with emergency neonatal care, they'll tell the mother, look, like, lower your expectations. don't we don't know if this child will live. We'll do the best we can. We can get to. My mother tells a story about waking up on the operating table during the cesarean, like, which her surgeon said was impossible, but she heard actual conversation, very distasteful conversation about my life prospects that the surgeons were having. And then maybe, I don't know if it was the most appropriate thing psychologically for my mom to then tell me that story. that, but that's a whole other issue. But the point is that it was very touch and go. And then to add kind of insult to injury, there was a random power outage, uh, like 2 weeks after I was born or something, where there was quite a significant delay in the time it took for the generators to come back on, for the breathing assistance to happen in the neonatal ward, and nurses had to go around with handheld. So my mom had a pet theory that maybe um, the because one of the possible causes to brain damage is lack of oxygen to the brain. So in some instances, babies get tangled in the umbilicus and then they're strangled during the birth process. And um, another common factor that leads to the damage that then expresses itself as CP is strokes. So I have no reason for this. It's purely a gut feeling, but I believe I had a stroke during the birth process. Um, I think I had a small stroke, and that parts of my brain were damaged and deoxygenated as a result. My mom thinks it could have happened post birth. If I really get into the weeds of it, I think that, as is very common, my mother carries a lot of guilt about the fact that her body didn't do what it was supposed to. She feels responsible for having had a disabled child, and perhaps was her way of distancing and saying the damage happened once I was out of the body. I don't know.
Mm.
Like, it's not easy for me to talk to her about these things. These things are very charged for her. I've repeatedly told her that's not your cross to bear. Like, I'm happy to be alive with the body that I have. As difficult and frustrating as it can be, I still see it as this precious gift. But I think for her, it's difficult to separate out her own conflict emotions around bringing me into the world, and the idea that she must somehow intentionally, unintentionally have done something wrong because the birth went wrong. And I don't really think of it like that. Um, but I know it's hard. It's hard for any
Mm.
mother. And these are not easy things to talk about for any mother. So in terms of my birth, um, yeah, that's basically what they say to parents in that situation is they say, look, there's a sort of there's a strong with all these things together, there's a very strong likelihood that CP will happen. So the fact that the baby is so premature, the fact that there's respiratory distress at birth, the fact that there's infections, and the fact that the birth was traumatic and unplanned. Um, there's a very strong correlation between prematurity and CP. So that we can just say. But I have met people who were even more premature than me, who had similar birth circumstances, who do not have CPs. It's not a guarantee. Increasingly, like with so many facts of the human body and health, I think they're discovering that there's lots of different factors that have to come together. Like, there is some indication, based on the little research that's been done, that there is a genetic predisposition to CP.
Mm.
It's not a genetic condition, but unsurprisingly, there is perhaps genetic predisposition to have certain experiences in the womb, to be more vulnerable to damage in the brain. And then basically what they tell parents in these circumstances is they say, moderate your expectations. You just have to watch and see what happens. with this
Mm.
child. So, right away they do tests, like they would, they mobilize the legs and the feet and fresh out of the womb, and right away they could see that my baseline level of spasticity, especially below the waist, was like really, really high. So with spastic CP, like I said, the chief characteristic is spasticity. What does that mean? Well, it just means clonus, I think is the medical term, extremely high muscle tone. So, like a lot of people are actually born with what you could say is pathologically low tone, low clonus. But interestingly, just I find this interesting anyway. Like a lot of people have such low tone from birth, just constitutionally, that it actually causes problems for them in life. But it's very rare that like extreme low tone gets pathologized. But when you have extremely high tone, it's very obvious because it really limits your mobility. In many cases, kids with spastic CP have such high tone in parts of their body that there really is just an extremely limited range of motion in that part of the body. And this typical medical intervention is to actually use surgery, cutting tendons, cutting muscle fibers, just to create more length and more room for any kind of mobility to even happen, because the muscle is so spastic. And I mean, that has like a set of radiating effects. So like um it means if there's limited mobility, then it means you're probably also relying on a very limited range of movements or compensations in the parts of the body that are more mobile. So then that puts strain on the body over, months and years, because you're you're relying on some parts of the body over others. So then, you get joint damage, muscle weakness, also areas of the body are much tighter, so then the veins and arteries are compressed in that area. With the mobility issues come coordination and balance issues, because there's whole parts of the body that just can't be called upon to be used in a range of motion. Then
Mm.
that's inevitable. And then also pain, constant spasticity creates chronic pain. Um, and then also constant spasticity can look like muscle strength, because when a muscle is tensed, it seems very hard. But the easiest way to imagine this is like if I asked you now to just like tense your fist for the next 5 minutes, that would be pretty exhausting, right?
Mm.
And the muscles are actually very, very weak. The nerve, as we know, that like to to have real muscle strength, you need a kind of economy of movement, right?
Mm.
You need some muscles to be tightening and loosening in tandem with each other, so that there's a balanced use of energy. And if you're tightening, you're also, I don't know the physics of it, but you're neurologically, neurochemically, you're building up a lot of tension, right? You're activating nerves. Um, and that tension eventually has to be released. So if your baseline is just a constant spastic tension, you can start to imagine what the felt sense of that is in the body, right?
Mm.
Um, so another thing I should mention is my kind of subcategorization of CP is that I suppose I would be classified as having hemiplegic diplegic CP. So what that means is hemiplegia means like like the what do you call it, the lateral bilateral half of the body. So typically, just because of how the brain works, people with CP almost always have, not always, but it's very common. Like the type of CP I have, like I said, accounts for about 70 to 80% of all CP. So obviously the way the damage happens tends to express in a certain way. So what is it? It's spasticity predominates, and one side of the body is more affected than the other. So as you said in your intro, I'm super left dominant, and part of that is not it's not incidental. Like my right side is more afflicted. So everything like the right leg has always been more tight and stiff and difficult to more, but there are specific muscle fibers that are dead or damaged that correlate more to the right side. Now, does that mean that there isn't spasticity in globally in the rest of the body? No. It's a bit of a complicated thing. Like for convenience, the surgical interventions and the classification of people will be like in terms of hemiplegia, and then diplegia means like is it the upper part of is it these upper limbs or these lower limbs? So for me, the some people with CP, they have spasticity in their hands. So you'll often see a hand that is spastic. It's very difficult to. I have spasticity in my hands. They are unusually stiff and tight, but the parts of the brain and the parts of the bundles of muscle fibers that are affected are much more afflicting for me what is below the waist. And primarily my points of affliction are the key areas of trouble are the pelvis, um, the hamstrings, and most especially the feet and the Achilles tendons. So when I was born, what was immediately visually obvious was that the Achilles tendons was so spastic. The area of the ankle and the feet and toes was so spastic that, like, I mean, as I speak to you, I am spastically clawing my toes. Um, when I was a child, my parents would often and sister would often, if I was sitting watching TV, they would often like poke me verbally or physically and be like, claws, because I was gargoyling, the ground. Um, and they'd have to say like, you don't need to be doing that. The body is sort of, it's, it's hard to explain. Like a lot of people think the spasticity is background, low level, and sort of constant, but there are moments where spasming happens. And this is something I think would be interesting to talk more about, which I think is really like pervasively important in CP in my experience, is that CP is a condition that affects and afflicts the muscles. It expresses itself as muscle spasticity, which then has all these effects on the body and movement, balance. But it is a problem of the brain. It's a problem of the nerves. And that's something that even for me, as someone who's lived with this from my first, wailing breath, is that like, even for me, the complexity or you could say richness or nightmarishness or however you want to frame it of that relationality between something, the messaging of the brain, um, and the working of the nerves, the sending of messages down through the central nervous system, and then the reactivity of the muscles and that body, that sort of that that thought body relationship. That is the big mystery and the big that's where it's at with CP for me in terms of the problems and the cure. Because very often what physical therapists and surgeons do is they, given their worldview or their framework of materiality, scientific materialism, is they go, okay, well, this tendon or this muscle's too tight. So let's fix that. Well, how do we do that? Well, we can give exercises, we can stretch, or typically orthopedic surgeons, we can just cut it. It's too short, just cut it. That's what they did on my Achilles tendons, four separate times, twice on each side. Because when I was a baby, the Achilles tendon was so short and the feet were so spastic that it was very, very difficult to just do a normal step. So my accommodation was to toe walk. I was a ballerina. I would just walk on my toes because it just wasn't possible. It's still very difficult for me now at my current state of flexibility to put my, like, I can't, if I squat, I can't put my heel on the ground currently because my Achilles tendon is very tight. Um, all the muscles and tendons around there. And it's like I'm also so accustomed to working around that incredibly limited range of motion. So I experience my feet and ankles as a block,
Yeah.
occupying space in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I work around that. I walk and move within those boundaries. And so doing surgery creates more room. It creates more possibilities. But I think it's a complicated thing because, like I said, it's not only the lack of range of motion, it's also the weakness, the underlying weakness of the muscles. Because there's kind of a Faustian bargain in all this. With CP, you don't really have muscle strength, but your muscles are always stiff. And that stiffness actually compensates for the lack of strength.
Mm.
So I am constantly propelling myself and moving through the spasticity. The spasticity is keeping me upright. If you were to remove it neurologically,
Yeah.
if you were to go into the brain and if you could take out that constant background noise of spasticity, I would have to learn to walk from scratch. I would
And
have to.
talk, would it affect your like not just your motor skills, but also your like would it wouldn't surely it would affect all skills, no?
Well, this is something I've been trying to think about. Like my CP is undoubtedly classifiable as mild, um, because it's a spectrum. So, like at the special needs school I went to as a kid, there were people who had similar types of affliction to me, but their spasticity was so severe that the spasticity prevented them from articulating words clearly, prevented them from controlling the movement of their eyes or tongue, prevented them from ever there was never going to be a situation where, even with many surgeries and physical therapy, they would never learn to walk unaided. So I'm considered a mild case, but I'm also aware of the fact that the spasticity, as much as we can localize and classify it, it is ambient. So, like, I have and have had many other conditions which don't always get mentioned as part of the CP profile, but they're absolutely there. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, like I have had and I'm susceptible to having many, many bladder infections, way more than the average like male-bodied person, I think, because there's so much spasticity around my bladder.
Mm.
And another thing is that it it's as a result of that, it's very easy for me to because I'm so used to spasticity and tightness, and
Mm-hmm.
the felt sense of a full bladder for a lot of people is discomfort and tightness. But
Mm.
for me, I always have that. So it's very common with CP that you can just be sitting for hours and not notice that you need to go to the bathroom. And there have been situations in my life where I would do that for so long that the message comes, but I ignore it. It was also my personality to just sit for long periods of time and disembody, dissociate from pain and discomfort. So um, I've had situations where I will stand up and I'll be like in agonizing pain. It would happen in high school sometimes. I'd actually just forget to go to the bathroom. Constipation. When I was a child, I had terrible constipation, like for the ages. Like it was a family event. I would just build up so much turd inside me, and the process of giving birth to these like leviathan poos was so extreme. And like my sister was there with a wet cold cloth dabbing my brow. My mom would be feeding me prunes, and this is a known thing that kids with CP have.
Yeah.
um, and it was like and I still struggle with this, and that's because of spasticity. That's because, like I was thinking of before this interview, like how would I sort of more poetically explain the felt sense of CP? Well, whether you like it or not, so much of your life is felt or experienced in terms of like the build up. But on the one level, there's constant tension. So your baseline is much more like for me, I'm much more comfortable just operating at a level where my baseline is I'm guessing probably a level of nervous tension that is so much higher than some other people. Um, I joke that I know what those Chihuahua dogs feel like. So some of us just have, and you don't have to have CP to have a more anxious baseline. But with CPUs, you like don't really have a choice. So um, to get back to your question, like if you were to remove the key source in the brain, the because what's happening with CP is that brain damage, that defective neurons, they are sending lots of scrambled signals to the muscles, telling them to be more
Yeah.
spastic than they need to. So there is a surgery which can do this to a point. It's often done to kids with not so mild CP who can kind of walk on their own. They have this surgery in the early, like before they hit puberty. And what they do is it's called selective dorsal rhizotomy. And they go into the spine, they cut open the spine, and they just probe the bundles of nerve fibers and they can see which one is fucked. And of course, it's a very kind of brute procedure because, these are very subtle realities. So what they do is they try to be very minute and they just slice. Again, all this cutting that the surgeons love to do in this, they just slice those nerves. And the idea being that if you just take them out of the equation, there's so
Mm.
much neuroplasticity in the body that you're basically just taking out the defective wires. Imagine a house that has defective wiring that you've just gotten used to your whole life with
Mm.
flashing spooky lights, and then you're just like, you know what, I'm just gonna turn off this part of the
Yeah.
electrical grid. But in this case, it's an organic system that can grow. So the idea is that if the earlier you do this for kids, the more liable they are to forget that quote unquote defective neurology and to start compensating and building new neural pathways. And so what people say is it cuts out a degree, it removes the degree of this spasticity. And this opens up into a whole debate about like what is CP as a condition? Because strictly speaking, it's not neurodegenerative in the way that some other neurodegenerative conditions are. It's not like the actual physical structure of the muscle tissue is breaking down because of an autoimmune response or something. What it is that the brain is got all these scrambled, kooky signals. The
Mm.
best way I can explain it as a felt lived experience is I feel like so much background activity, neurological activity is there's so much static. I feel like I experience a lot of noise. Um, and I actually hear it. I feel like in my psychological imaginative sense, I actually feel like I'm hearing the command prompts that are supposed to be, when you look at your, what is it called on the computer when you press control, whatever it is, and you see that, I'm so bad at terminology, but you can see like how much memory is being used, how much expenditure there is behind the scenes. And you're like, what is that program that my computer that's running in the background and my computer is expending so much RAM on or whatever? Like, I feel like I'm aware of all of that all the time because for the best that I can tell, a lot of people just there are like signals happening all the time to tell us like feel hungry, flex that muscle, and they're mostly unconscious, right? For the average person. When the average person gets out of bed, they're not so aware of like, okay, this muscle has to move. I feel like I'm seeing and hearing every one of those command prompts at all times. So it feels very noisy in my
Mm.
body. That's the
Mm.
best way I can explain it. And some of that noise is unnecessary. It like feels like there's a lot of static it feels like what that misfiring, maybe I'm just inventing or imagining this, but why is that a problem in this context? It feels very noisy. It feels very uh, full of, and this intensifies when I'm tired, when there's a, I think a lot of people, so like if I have a full bladder, like when involuntary processes are happening, what most people would consider involuntary processes, and then more voluntary conscious processes are happening simultaneously, I spaz out. I can say that because I'm medically spastic. But I literally experience spazzing out. So if I've been sitting at a cafe, with lots of stimulation and noises around me, and then my bladder fills with urine while I'm sitting there, and then I'm also like doom scrolling on my phone in between answering emails. I'm thinking, speaking with my internal dialogue, and then I have to stand up, and also I have to stand up, simultaneously pick up a napkin to throw in the trash, and then I become aware of my full bladder. It's like I feel like I short circuit. It feels like there is a there is a limit to the. It feels like very loud and very scrambled. It feels like
Mm,
it. Personally, I hate to compare the human body to machines and computers because I don't believe the human body works like that. But in those moments, I feel like a defective robot. I feel like a science fiction movie process in which, you see the robot kind of like, it's like overload, overload, like that's how it feels. And it already feels like there's so much nervous tension ambiently in my system. A
mm.
lot of people with CP talk a lot, like I said, and I think that's because there is this baseline increase, that chihuahua, shivery chihuahua dynamic. And it is true, like, when you step on a Lego piece or something and you
Yeah,
you know that
yeah,
phenomenon of like that jolted set where you hear a loud noise. Now imagine if that's just like most of the time.
yeah. I
So,
mean, you've said to me, don't ring the doorbell when you get here. Text me because if you ring the doorbell, I'm gonna like my coffee's gonna like go everywhere, kind of thing, and it takes your
well,
body a long time to.
yeah, and that's not me. That's not a learnt response. That's an innate neurological response. So with CP, you may have seen those honestly quite hilarious, but also disturbing videos of like newborn babies. With newborn babies, they have to do that. It's called the Moro reflex test. So you should Google it. It's actually really hilarious, but also it seems quite cruel. The baby's literally just been born, right? Now the doctor's like spanking its ass, like investigating its limbs, and then they have to do this thing where they take the baby and they hold it and then they put one hand behind and then they let the baby drop and they have to see whether the baby like facially but also the baby does this thing, right? And that thing is called the Moro reflex. If a baby doesn't have that, it can indicate developmental or brain problems. Or now with CP, babies in the normal range are supposed to have that from birth. If they now in the in able-bodied people, that reflex, it gets like reabsorbed. It gets like it goes away. But with me, I have that reflex for my whole life. So my startle reflex for loud noises, look, as someone who meditates and does a lot of kind of contemplative practices, hypnosis, it is possible for me to relax to such an extent that that goes away. So that's also very interesting. Like, personally believe that my CP has made me especially interested in the extent to which one can have, anyone, disabled or not, can have agency over that feedback process, the emotions, because I know that there are situations in which my spasmodic reactions can be heightened. So it's like if I am walking past a group of people who are loudly talking and laughing, and then I start imagining that they're talking about the way I'm walking or the way I look, and then I start imagining how I might look from their perspective, that kind of dissociative mental process has an immediate effect on my body.
Mm,
And I
mm.
start to again glitch, spaz out, and actually lose the ability to walk in that moment. I'm most likely to trip. And I think that probably people without CP also have that. You know, the more it's that the power of the mind and brain and breath and emotions
Oh
to
yeah.
influence these seemingly involuntary reactions of the body.
Oh
But with
yeah.
CP, it's like you see it. I mean, I'll give you an example that was recent. I was talking to my mother and sending a voice note to her, and I was expressing how, like, I think as I've gotten older, I've never really. So I was saying two things to her. I was saying I've never been very into being a tourist because I don't. I like new places and cultures and people, but that's the part I like. Invite me to your house and let me just live your schedule or like hang out with you. Don't start making me trying to go and sightsee. I don't like that. But I've stopped liking it even more because I now feel as I'm aging and neglecting regular exercise, I feel even less strong or confident in my body. And I was telling her, then you add to that the stress of being in a new place, a new language, not knowing where you are, having to carry a bag, miss a train, miss a plane. And I was like, you can keep it. I'm too old. I don't want that. But as I was telling her that, I was sitting exactly where I am now. I was taking a sip of coffee while holding my phone and talking, which already is quite a big like cognitive burden for someone with CP, but it's something I can do without being totally overwhelmed. But as I was telling her about my dislike of having to do all that stuff, I was imagining it. And as I imagined it, my body immediately spasmed in anticipation of actually doing it. Um, that's what I mean by that nervous, very
Yeah. You
sensitive,
like
very reactive.
auto-suggested yourself.
Sorry.
I said it's like you auto-suggested yourself.
Well, my nervous system is very autosuggestible. I am very twitchy. That's one of the sort of the double-edged sword of CP is that because you're always so tight, you're also very sensitive. You're always on. So like the tiniest, like especially in my feet, I mean, my feet can be so ticklish, but I can train myself to down regulate. And then I won't want to kick someone in the face when they touch my foot. But my average baseline, because this is another thing, like if I had to explain what CP feels like, one aspect of it is that if you're not like very consciously relaxed and releasing that tension,
Mm.
down regulating the spasticity, you always feel like the smallest thing could startle you or set you off. and
Yeah.
and then that spasticity, remember I said you're using that tightness, you're using that spasticity to hold yourself upright,
Yeah.
you're using it in as a substitute for like real range of motion, real fluid range of motion,
Yeah. I
balance
mean,
and muscle strength.
if you have a rigid ruler, that I don't know why this is the image in my head, but like a
uh,
ruler is rigid and that helps it act as a ruler, you know? If
mhm,
it's a fluffy
mhm.
ruler, it's not a very good structure. So it's like that rigidity is propelling. I can completely see how that like it's like physics, right? It's literally just basic physics in
Yes,
that it's
it is
able to
about
use the
propulsion.
space, yeah, propulsively,
it
exactly, yeah.
it is about propulsion because when I it's very funny, like when people see me going about my day, I've left the house, I've put my clothes on, I've got a bag on one shoulder, I've sort of very carefully calibrated like how much weight I have on one side, and then I've got shoes on. Shoes and heels are very useful for me because they don't they allow my leg and foot to kind of work as one spastic unit. There isn't really range of motion in my ankle and toes. They're just doing this inside the shoe. So when I'm then just like go clopping around, like with that spastic leg, someone might see me and they'll see a limp or whatever, a typical CP gait, but they see me moving like really fast. They see me walking on a track. I seem very functional, but if suddenly there's loud noise or if people are in my way and then I have to kind of maneuver around, I have to, I have to scoot out of someone's way. Like when I'm on my track, when I'm going, when I'm propelled, the spasticity is helping me. Also the high level of nervous activation is helping me. But if
Mm.
I'm in, it's not very sustainable because, as anyone who exercises knows, the more relaxed a muscle is, you don't want a tight spastic muscle when you need a certain amount of tension. You do. But you don't want an overactivated nervous system because you're more likely to pull a muscle or to do damage or so it's a strange thing because you need to kind of hype yourself and fire yourself up to just like get going, but as soon as I'm required to do any kind of like circular movements, this is
Mm.
why psychologically I often feel like we've had this conversation before, my self-image is very linked to sort of mythic ideas about being like a doll or being a puppet or being a robot.
Pinocchio.
I don't identify with that because I have a very but my body feels very much like an articulated puppet or doll that I'm trying to make work, that I'm trying to possess or occupy in a certain way because it is very jointy. It doesn't have the movements of CP are very stiff and you have these very limited, sort of path of least resistance from A to B movements that you do. And when those
Mm.
get disrupted, it can be kind of transcendent and wonderful because suddenly you realize, oh, there's so much more scope. There's so much like more energy or room. There's so much space
Mm.
outside that range of motion or those very tight movements that often feel very like linear. They don't feel very, you know, they're,
Yeah.
they're not very round or expansive. So, um, but yeah, so if I just say what the kind of the felt sense of CP is like, it's kind of, you feel like you might fall over at any given moment. Like it's very difficult to feel physically and emotionally balanced. And you're often using movement to propel yourself. So I also think that's where the intensive talking comes from as well. That's also kind of pushing forward,
Mm.
propulsion to keep
Yeah.
going, or else you you have to attend to like these very scattered signals in the body. There's, like I said, there's a lot of ambient nervous noise, and it can often feel like one moment you relax and the next moment you have a destabilizing thought. You feel it's vertiginous, like from vertigo. So like one analogy I often give people is if you've ever walked on ice or snow in not the best shoes, and don't recommend this as someone with spastic CP, but I have done it several times. And you have these micro calibrations in your ankle, or when you're trying to do a new yoga position, you've got that kind of shaky, unstable because you have to do all these micro calibrations to get stability,
Yeah.
and 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 it feels like that's happening all the time. Even now, when I'm sitting in the chair, like I can sit very still and I know on one level, okay, I I'm not gonna fall over. I'm not
Mm.
actually falling over. But there is a part of me which is always, and this is also very interesting to talk about in terms of psychology and personality, because my earliest memories, I'm I'm guessing, are probably of like I tried to move and I couldn't, or I tried to move and there was pain, or I moved in that direction and I wobbled and fell, or it's funny, I've never fallen so badly that I've broken a bone, which is interesting because CP is so much about losing your balance and falling and not having muscle strength, but you cultivate such an innate sense, a kind of background program that's running at all times, like don't fall over, don't destabilize. You know, that the number one, I'm guessing, I don't know a lot of other people with spastic CP, so I haven't picked their brains about this, but my guess is that that is a very common experience, that there's a part of your nervous system or yourself that is always saying like avoid pain, stay within these limits, don't um don't fall over. Like that's kind of primary.
Mm.
It's even that moral that moral reflex that babies have, that they need to have in that first in those first weeks of life, like the fear of falling. It's like, and then there's the flip side to it too. I was thinking about this. If your personality and your day-to-day activities are so much built around mounting nervous activation and tension, then there's
Mhm.
also a great desire and need for release.
Yeah.
So much of my life is about ratcheting up spastic tension and then releasing it.
Mm.
I have a very spasmodic life, a very spasmodic, even with the constipation as a child. You could argue it's reflective of that. The reason that CP kids have these monster turds is because maybe it's their body isn't always giving them, there's this spasticity in the colon, right?
Yeah.
But then they're also, it's the same with the bladder. They're building up all this, and then it sort of has to really be like sort of
Yeah.
emotionally, cathartically pushed. You know, it's like
Yeah.
your life is tension and release.
But it's also, I've been wanting to say this for a while because so many things you've said has made me think about what it must be like for you in terms of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Because even the average person is overstimulated and stressed out, and they're having to, reset their nervous systems and, do some kind of exercise or meditation practice or whatever it is that helps them kind of regulate because it's in it's in that state that we're able to rest and digest. So if you're would you say that you're constantly in the sort of fight and flight response, and that, or do you think that it's not so much about fight and flight and it's more just I don't know. I mean, maybe that's also with that languid thing that we often talk about, and the ability to just like be completely still. The payoff is that you've got less sensory processing that you need to do, so you can get into a more relaxed state. But the negative is that your muscles lose out on also just like needed exercise that's helping them to become supple. Does that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. It's something I've been thinking about a lot because on the one hand, I think, like I said, I suspect that my early childhood experiences made me very interested in like the mysteries of the mind body breath connection, because I think it's obvious to everybody that that connection exists, but for me it was so obvious because it's
Mm,
like I can go from one moment where it just feels like whole capabilities of my body are completely unavailable to me, or I can feel so like overwhelmed. Um, and then very quickly, I can also downregulate. Like that's a funny thing about CP, is that there's all this spasticity, but it feels so intense and there might can be so much pain, but the relief is also so fast and so extreme too. It's like the highs are low and the lows are low, and it's very quick, but it's also very inconsistent.
mm,
So um, the good news of CP is that there's a lot of obvious interventions, breathing, meditation, massage, a warm bath that can really dramatically change the like state of spasticity, relieve pain, to sort of downregulate the nervous system. But because there's always that signal coming from the brain, it just the it returns to its spastic baseline so fast, like
mm,
so fast.
mm.
This is why a lot of adults are pushing for the selective dorsal rhizotomy surgery as being valuable for older patients too, because it's the idea that like you'll never, it's complicated because people get this surgery, they take out those defective nerves, but then you never get like all of it. And people will say over time, it's like they return to a kind of baseline. And then often when you do that selective dorsal rhizotomy surgery, like I said, you're like a puppet with their strings cut. Suddenly there's no spasticity and you're just like, you don't know how to walk. So you have to do about 6 months minimum of exercise, strength building, physio to learn again to walk with less ambient noise and spasticity. But then, of course, this muddies the waters because it's not clear whether it was just that mind body cultivation of
Mm.
exercise, yoga, physio, which made you more functional, or the surgery. The surgery is definitely doing something. Weirdly, it also has side effects. So, like, people suddenly feel nerve pain that they never felt before. It's like once the muscle tension is gone, they suddenly start having shooting nerve pain, where before there was only spasticity. So I don't
Mm.
have like nerve pain. Um, Recently, when I really kind of hit a rock bottom in terms of not attending to stretching and exercising, I did start to get like shooting nerve pain, but I think that was because there was so much spasticity and the nerves were actually getting trapped. They weren't, and then a little more exercise and just movement like resolved that right
Mm.
away. But it's interesting to hear about people's experiences. I am not sure I want this surgery. I'm turning 40 next year. And as much as there's a part of me that thinks, wow, if you could take some of that spasticity away, there'd be so much less pain. It would be so much easier to deal with. Another part of me finds it a very frightening prospect because
Mm.
everything I know about my emotional reactivity, how I feel in my body, what being touched feels like, what talking to strangers feels like I'm so sensitive to words and like I feel like my nervous system is very sensitive. And I started taking, about my experiences with this oral baclofen. I had never taken pharmaceuticals, muscle antispastic medication at any point in my therapies and life. And when I initially took this drug in my 30s, which is for CP type spasticity, it was kind of revelatory because suddenly I was realizing that there was spasticity in parts of my body, like here in my neck, leading into the back of the skull that I hadn't even like perceived. And to feel it drain away was really cathartic and quite emotionally overwhelming. But then this is a habit forming Valium type drug. It changed the way I felt in my body to such an extent. It started giving me such negative emotional side effects. I'd never reached a point of suicidal ideation in any other instance like I had with regular use of this drug that I became afraid of it and stopped using it. So I wonder, yes, I think the drug itself has unacknowledged emotional, psychological side effects. I shudder to think about these less verbal, more severely disabled kids with CP who have been given massively high doses of oral baclofen and they're not even able to articulate. If they were experiencing anything like I was experiencing, I shudder to think. But maybe it was also a mixture of experiencing a different neurology, a dramatically different neurology, and that was really destabilizing on a psychological level. The amount of my negative self-talk was amplified every night. I had night because I already have this, but every night I had divisive, nightmarish dreams of having my body being ripped apart, my character assassinated, my character ripped apart, like such a sense of self-breakdown. So
I'm
negative.
sorry for laughing, and you know why I'm laughing, just because I'm privy to a lot of these, and sometimes it's genuinely like you can only laugh because it's such a it's such a consistent aspect of your life, this sort of your dream life, and all of the like these interactions that we've had so many conversations about that. Yeah, it's
Mm.
also strange trying to talk to you now as a friend, but also as an interview. So I'm kind of having a weird thing in my own brain where I'm
Are you
hearing myself
spazzing
talk.
out?
Well, I'm just hearing myself talk to you in a different way that I actually do talk to you because I'm
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's just this sort of external imaginary audience that it's like messing with my brain. Anyway, but this
Yeah.
is a good segue into the second question, of which there are 10. But I think that you've kind of answered a lot of questions already.
Mhm.
So, but as we go through them, we can sort of figure it out. But so I said, presumably there was a time when you were unaware of having CP because you were so young, and that the concept CP did not exist because you were sub one, for example. Um, but as you've already said, so many of your earliest memories are about the limitations of your body, are about pain, or about falling over. And so, uh, I said, what is your earliest memories of concretizing your awareness of your disability in relation to the world around you? Which you've basically answered, but I think that you're talking about it interestingly, almost from like a more psychological perspective, in terms of um in terms of that, your ability to perceive your entire reality within this body, within this life, and then to suddenly have a medication or a surgery that alters it entirely. I mean, the sort of the dysmorphia must be very real, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I also only imagine because I can't know. But I mean, having had these experiences with baclofen, it gives me pause. And I've never felt like I mean, gosh, this is a whole emotional, psychological can of worms, what I was about to say. I've never really thought, wow, I can't wait to cure my CP. Um, but that has a lot to do with how I was raised. My sister became my older sister. She's 3 years older. She is a really amazing, dedicated physiotherapist who specializes in pediatric physio for kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. Many of whom have CP, but also a range of other conditions. And it's because of growing up with me that was um, not only because of but yeah, and um, she has a lot of patients, a lot of parents who won't even tell their kids their diagnosis. They won't even tell their kids that they have cerebral palsy, and so they're in mainstream schools, visibly, physically disabled, and their parents are refusing to tell them that they even have a condition from birth, or they're sort of directly or indirectly feeding them the lie that one day with enough treatment or through God's intervention they'll wake up and not be disabled. And I had a very different experience. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but I
No,
mean it
I
might
love
be
it, and I also
interesting
think it's a good PSA, actually.
because I want to return to something else about childhood, what you were saying about earliest memories and self-perception as disabled. Like um, but I was lucky, I believe, because my parents, they were solidly middle class, but they were very committed to taking care of me as a child with special needs. They sought out information very early on. They had the privilege of accessing that information because it's really sobering. On many occasions in South Africa, other parts of the world, I have encountered children who I think had a very similar type or level of CP to me, whose parents did not know what was wrong with them. They did not know why their kids were not reaching these developmental milestones, why they had pain, why they had stiffness, why they couldn't learn to walk without assistance. The reason I can walk today and be so independent is because I had surgeries, because I had physical therapy, because there was always an adult there to help me push past, like I'm not saying that able-bodied kids necessarily learn to walk entirely unaided either. That's not true. But little kids can get up and start to toddle, and then they fall over, and then with encouragement. But that capacity is there in their body. Like whereas for me it was not. If I was left to my own devices, I would never have become mobile. And I would have then also, without the interventions and encouragement of adults, it's not fun to stretch. It hurts like a motherfucker. You don't want to push with. everything about your CP accommodation, the one you build in your own nervous system, is avoid, walk within this tightrope, this narrow confines of what's easily doable for you and creates the least amount of pain. And that's a double-edged sword because it's what allows you to be functional. But if you lean too much on those compensations, you see this in kids with CP who've never really had proper targeted physiotherapy.
Mm.
They can walk, but they're walking on their toes, for example, or
Mm.
and and that's good in that they found the compensation, but the damage to bone and nerve and over time, like, so I don't want to overly pathologize accommodations. But anyway, my parents, they took me to the one special needs school that was in Durban, South Africa. And my mom always tells this story as a sort of fundamental moment in her life as the parent of a disabled child. She went to this special needs school, and she was still very emotional, and she was having the interview for intake with the principal. Um, and this was, like I said, this was the only specialist school that was available in apartheid South Africa at the time. And um, she said, like, she was like kind of weepy, if I remember correctly. And she was like, my child, he's just different. It's just. And then this particular principal said, ma'am, I'm sorry to break it to you, but the sooner you get your head around this, the better, in my opinion. Your child is handicapped. Your child has a disability, which is going to prevent him from functioning normally. He's like, your child isn't special, isn't. Stop using euphemisms. Your child is disabled, and we will provide him the necessary care. Now, CRIP studies, scholars, and disability activists can take issue with this framing. But at that moment, it was good because I went to this school, and as part of the curriculum, I received physical therapy within every day of school. And I was at that school from the age of, I started receiving treatment at that school from like 18 months old. So as to your question, like, the thing about CP is that it's a pediatric condition. You have it from birth, and the majority of treatment and intervention and attention, if you saw a graph, it's like it's the highest from the point of birth. It tapers off as you get older. And this is actually, in terms of the sociocultural aspects of the condition, it's very interesting because, like, you are extraordinarily medicalized
Mm.
and medically assisted
Mm-hmm.
from the earliest moments of your life. And then increasingly as you grow, because you're a kid and you want to become more independent, it's like this is a key feature of CP. It's like your body doesn't belong to you, both in a neurological sense. You feel like your body could mutiny it or spaz out at any time. It doesn't always do what you think or want it to do. So in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, you feel like your body isn't your own to a certain extent, I would argue. But on a like sociological level, I mean, the gap I had to just exist as a child who didn't know themselves as disabled was infinitesimally small because I was preemptively diagnosed as going to have some form of fucked upness before I probably even came out the womb.
Mm.
So um, it's interesting to think about that. Like when you talk to a lot of people with CP, that's how they often describe the experience. They were like, I was touched, observed, pushed, prodded, cut into from as early as I can remember. I was cut into from the moment that my mom had a cesarean. Like the story of my life, you could say, began with someone with a usually an authoritative male medical authority cutting into me. But it also began with primarily female physical therapists gently, lovingly, supportively touching me in these soft, non uh, like invasive ways. So, but the common thread there is someone else touching, holding, supporting.
Mm.
And then there's this desire on the part of people with CP that I encounter to become more independent, especially for those people with the condition who struggle to speak or can't walk independently. It's really rough. You're an adult. You want to have a sex life. You want to date, but you've got this fussy parent or caretaker deciding what pants you should wear. And
Mm,
guess how they make those decisions? Not based on your fashion sense, what pants you like, how you want to present in the world, but are these pants going to be easy for me to take off when I have to give you a sponge bath? You know,
mm,
so you experience this lack of agency over your own body. You know, you don't get to decide how you move around. And it's positive to have parents who hold you up, literally hold your hand, provide you the care that you need. But then so much of that is it's overdetermined in the earliest stages of life. So you experience your body as having limitations. You've had chronic pain your whole life. I mean, I was in an incubator being fed through tubes from the moment. What was that actual gap from when I came out the womb? It was so small, that gap, you know, blindfolded in an incubator. And it's like my mom only really she got to hold me briefly after she couldn't breastfeed me directly on the breast because I was in an incubator. So she had to she expressed milk and then fed me in a bottle or through a tube. But like you see this photo of her, she's so triumphant when I'm let out of the incubator because it's like her and the nurses are like, thank fucking God this kid lived because we weren't sure. And so it's also a strange experience for the parents because, like I was saying, my mom and dad were told, we don't know how fucked up this baby's going to be. Like, I mean, they probably didn't say it exactly like that, but maybe. Um, and they were like, so just assume he won't reach any developmental milestones. Assume he won't learn to talk. What revenge I got. Assume he won't learn to dress himself independently. Assume he won't reach a certain educational level. So I surpassed all those expectations. But it was like my parents, I can't imagine what that was like for them. They were
mm.
just sitting waiting to see what I would or wouldn't do. I mean, in a
Yeah,
way, it's like that with any kid. But I also
yeah, but I
didn't
think
talk for the first 5 years of life, and they were worried that it was a developmental problem.
mm.
But I just didn't want to. I was, I was absorbing information before I made my, big debut as a talker.
I mean, it's in you and I've spoken about this a lot, which is that the sort of bizarre irony that your dad was this famous South African body, you know, body beat guy. He was into aerobics. Everything about his life was physicality, physical
Hmm.
fitness, able-bodiedness. And there's a really nice newspaper clipping that you've shown me before, which is really, which is I think there's a photo of you there is it in the studio or something?
Yes, I have very vivid memories of going to the American photographer who took photos for this article that a journalist wrote because my dad became very involved in the Natal Cerebral Palsy organization. And because he was a South African celebrity, he's so focused on physical health, he really wanted to speak out on this issue. And a lot of people like he really did a lot. A lot of people are very appreciative. And there's still so much misunderstanding in South Africa and the world about what this condition is.
Mm,
Whether the parents did something wrong, in some cultural contexts, there's a belief that the kids have been afflicted by witchcraft,
mm,
or some sort of other spiritual condition that can be cured through other ways. Another thing is that when kids are nonverbal or struggle to communicate or move, it's very easy to assume that they are mentally handicapped. And cerebral palsy, as a rule, does not involve intellectual impairment.
no,
There
my aunt,
can be
yeah,
intellectual impairment.
as you know, my aunt has cerebral palsy, and she's always been in a wheelchair, and it's really affected her speech. And as a result, everyone just assumes that she's got that there's like a cognitive handicap as opposed to, I mean, it is
Mhm.
ultimately of the brain, but it's a different type of handicap entirely.
Right.
And that
And
was her whole life, was trying to prove to people that no, it's a speech. Ultimately, it lands up being a speech impediment.
it's really, like I have strong memories as a child. As a child, I think I was more visibly disabled. It was harder for me to hide the position of my leg. And I did actually, there was a time when I did walk. We didn't talk about this, one other common supplementary thing that happens with CP is that you get strabismus, especially with hemiplegia, like one eye is squint. So
Is
I
that
had to
what evidence
wear
was? Sorry, can you say it
like
again?
a wandering squint eye. So
Uh,
it correlates. It's the opposite eye to the side of the brain that is. I think it was my left eye. So I had to
I don't.
wear.
I think squint is a South Africanism. I've discovered this since living in the UK. I could be wrong, but I don't think that people outside of South Africa have the same understanding of what we do when we say squint.
Yeah, because I think most people just mean squint, like narrow your
Yeah,
eye.
like you
Yeah,
narrow your eyes. Whereas in South Africa, we
a
use it in terms of
crossed eye.
cross-eyed or one eye is going in a different sort of, there's something
Mm.
asymmetrical about the eyes. Yeah.
So the eye, I had to have eye therapy. I had to wear a pirate patch
Hmm.
to use the weaker eye to strengthen it. So you don't. I'm quite unusual in that my you don't see that eye problem that much. But
No, I've
like
never noticed it before.
when I was a kid, you could see it more. The way that I held my body instinctively, I had less concern about concealing the fact that I was disabled. So I've learned to do certain things with my body that makes me less obviously disabled, like
Hmm.
to outsiders. But when
Hmm.
I look at photos of myself as like a 5 or 4 year old kid, I was not doing that. I also hadn't had as much therapy and learned how to hold myself, but it's like only later did that vanity set in, that awareness of being perceived by others and judged by others. And it's always an interesting thing. I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but there have been stages in my life where I will almost willfully not try to hide my disability because I'm like, fuck the world, why should I do this? But then I'm also like, ooh, by leaning into this, I'm not taking care of myself. I'm like avoiding stretching. I'm like, there's a whole complicated psychology around that. But what's interesting as a child is that, it's just like your aunt. I grew up a lot where I have a lot of memories where people would come up to my. Always sucks as a kid where adults talk over your head, literally and figuratively, and where they assume you can't understand them and you have no agency. But it's only just intensified with disability, especially a physical disability that people are mistaking for some other kind of disability. Where, like, yeah, I remember people in the store, like in the grocery store, people would run into my mom and I'd be there and they would be having these fat conversations about me and what's wrong with his legs. Sometimes even strangers, or like, like is he gonna get better? Like,
Hmm.
and my mom actually developed a shorthand because in the late 80s, early 90s, there was that movie which, ironically, I've actually never watched, um, with Daniel Day-Lewis, where he played, I think, the Irish guy with severe CP. The movie won an Oscar. It was called My Left Foot. And
I There's the lefty thing coming through again. Yeah.
yeah, and my mom would be like, he has spastic cerebral palsy, and people would be like, what? That's another side note. Spastic cerebral palsy accounts for like 70 to 80% of all CP,
Mm.
and that category accounts for something like 75% of all mobility disorders on Earth. CP is the most common type of disorder that people have from birth that affecting coordination and mobility, but almost nobody understands it. Almost nobody,
Hmm.
unless they have a family member, and even then. So it tells you something about there's all this onus on getting kids functional in childhood, but not much focus on the condition across the lifespan. And weirdly, there's a sort of vicious cycle there too, because you get so bored of being observed and prodded and pushed and held and of your body not being your own from the earliest point of your life that you as you get older you just want to be left alone. you
Mm.
a lot of people with my level of CP put a lot of energy, consciously or unconsciously, into passing as able-bodied, and
Mm.
then it becomes a bit of a psychological emotional quandary because many people don't perceive you as being disabled. And so then when you reveal that you actually your every waking moment is factoring in your CP,
Mm.
then it's really hard to explain that to people because it's like you're an invisible minority.
Mm.
Um, and it's also doubly weird because very often you were less functional as a child and more obviously disabled as a child. So you feel like you're a bit of a day walker too, because I grew up surrounded for the earliest years of my development by adults who saw me as really fucked up and treated me in a very particular ways, and surrounded by peers who were very disabled. In the school I was in, I was surrounded by kids that didn't just have CP, but had a varying degrees or types of CP, and then also kids with every other form of social, cognitive, some kids had personality disorders in addition to, it was a real mix. But when it came to disability, congenital disorders, when it came to disability, I was just like, well, you know how kids are. I was like, well, we're all the same. Like, um, and that school was unique because everything was so racially class segregated in South Africa. But this school was surprisingly integrated even before the end of apartheid because it was just the only place where anyone could go to get treatment. So we even had a little bit of racial desegregation starting quite early because I didn't exactly know how it worked, but I think a lot of black South Africans who would get jobs at the school so their kids could access resources. I don't know the history there. Um, but the school was not perfect by any means, but it was the main institution that provided that support. Um, so I remember looking around me, and I remember the games we played. We didn't think of ourselves much as disabled. We knew that we
Mm.
had these conditions, but we spent so much time in this space,
Mm.
From I was going to that school before I was verbal, and
Mm.
seeing physical therapists, and so I didn't think so pathologically about the conditions. I didn't really see myself as very different to the other kids. Like I had friends, with congenital disorders and cognitive impairment, but I didn't really think of them as being like any less capable intellectually than me. And it has been quite an interesting experience to occasionally reconnect by chance with people from those early school days. And now I live alone, I take care of myself alone. I have a PhD. And then I see some people who were my best friends who I never saw as being unequal to me, who haven't had the same life trajectory. They weren't able to finish school because of the nature of their disabilities or just mind or body, um, or they have accomplished many things but have been forced to stay at home with an adult caregiver, and that's really influenced their life. It, and so it's interesting when you're a child. You, at the one hand, you're so hyper aware of being observed and medicalized, but on the other hand, you're also a kid who doesn't really think about these things. Um, and then I had the experience of being mainstreamed. So they basically told me, look, you'll be held back because we have to cater to the lowest common denominator because at the school there were classes where kids with varying needs and limitations were all together. So they said, you know, you can just have private physical therapy and then be mainstreamed. And then I had the fantastic experience of seeing myself through able-bodied shithead children's eyes. I'd seen myself through adults' eyes, but they weren't kids who were actively bullying me for being disabled. So when I was about 6 or 7, being bullied by people for being disabled was just such a mind-blowing experience because I was like, I'm handicapped. I was born this way. What's wrong with you? Like, I actually felt they were handicapped. I couldn't believe that they were. I knew that there were able-bodied people and non-able-bodied people, but I was like, you're making fun of me for being disabled? Something that just happened to me at birth? Like, Jesus, what a loser. Like, that was kind of my feeling. I was like, wow, you're so lame. You're so I can't even wrap my head around this. But you know, I wasn't always the best behaved kid at the special needs school too. You know, I occasionally took advantage of some of the. I mean, I was very friendly and supportive to a lot of my friends too, but I knew how to push the buttons, and I also knew how to manipulate adults too. It's very interesting when you're a kid who's seen through the eyes of, you know, this has been much commented upon by disability activists, but it's like, generally speaking, media representations of disability, especially physical disability, provide you two primary channels. Either it's my left foot. Well, usually they blend together. It's inspiration porn or trauma porn. So, wow, you've triumphed over the odds. You know, you're Oscar, bad example, Oscar Pistorius, like, you know, you've pushed yourself so hard, you've 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 accomplished so much despite the odds. Inspiration porn. Or it's like, wow, you've suffered so much,
Mm.
deservedly, undeservedly, how inspiring, but also thank God that's not me. You know,
Yeah.
disabled people become like it's like when I think a certain type of Christian watches The Passion of the Christ. It's like the more Mel Gibson shows them Jesus being fucked up, the more they're saved they feel. Because Jesus's job as a scapegoat is to be fucked up on behalf of all humanity, you know?
Yeah.
So I feel like disabled people take that martyred role too, like as a minority. Wow, look at how God or fate or life has thrown them a raw deal. The more we watch their pain and suffering, the more we feel like somehow we've saved as the audience. So,
Mm.
you know, as a little kid, you see yourself through the eyes of adults I was positioned as a source of inspiration and as a you're a Jonah. When you're disabled, people don't know how to relate to you because they're like, wow, I don't understand this person's pain. I also don't like having to think about it for extended periods of time. Their very presence is a reminder of the cruelty of existence.
Yeah.
Um, and so you see that as a kid. So I knew how to manipulate it too. So did my friends. Like, I knew how to use my adult caregivers' concern about my disability, their relationality to me as able-bodied people versus disabled people. I think I was learning that very early on too. You know, they called me the lawyer at school because I used to argue my way out of things, or
It's very Cher
you know.
Horowitz of you.
So sorry.
That's very Cher Horowitz of you. It's a Clueless reference. She's always arguing to get better grades or anything like that. But you know, even this reminds me of just like, you know, girls in gym class having their period every week. I mean, that's obviously not what's happening, but the male gym teacher is so uncomfortable that he'll just like give them whatever they want because he just doesn't want to have the conversation. I think that there is
The,
also just
the
like a yeah.
I was just going to say there's a sort of a darker side to that though, because I've also internalized that. As someone who passes for able-bodied and can accomplish quite a lot and has really gained a lot of capacity compared to where I started. It's very, I constantly question myself whether acknowledging my disability is trying, there's a voice inside that says that acknowledging it or mentioning it to other people or
Mm.
using it as a reason to, I don't know, just even bringing it up is pretending to have my period.
But
And then I tell myself, like, you don't deserve to be disabled. Like I avoid using public transport a lot of the time because
yeah,
I get into such an anxiety spiral about sitting in the disabled. It is difficult for me to navigate my way through a crowded bus or train. It does require a bit more effort for me to stand than to sit. But I know I can get away with it. And then I start thinking, should I stand? Because one, there's people who are more disabled than me who might need that chair more than me. Two, forcing myself to do something that's painful or difficult might make me stronger physically or spiritually or emotionally. Three, um, and then I start thinking, why don't I want to be disabled? I am disabled. I have every right to use the chairs which are designated by the current state of our society for disabled people. I was born disabled. I'll never not be disabled. But then elderly people come in and they look at me and they go, I've been told by elderly people to get up.
yeah,
And
that's
then and then I'm
true.
like,
Yeah,
do I get into this conversation with them where I say, I'm actually disabled, but then I have to
and you
prove to
did.
them that I am.
You did, and people applauded.
There was an occasion where that happened where a woman who seemed in America to be in chronic pain. I sat by the front of the bus in the reserved seats, and she sat across me. It wasn't even that there weren't other reserved seats. She just sat across me. And for the whole 10-minute ride, she just glared at me, glared. And I could see her building and building and building up. And then as I got off, she stood up and she wagged her finger at me and she said, "Do you know what these seats are for? Who do you think you are? You're a terrible person." And then I explained, I have spastic cerebral palsy. I've had it from birth. And she was so mortified. Some people actually clapped, yeah, because. And the problem was she was also disabled in some other way. I mean, she
Mm.
was in pain. I could tell she was
Mm.
in a lot of pain, emotionally, physically. But yeah, I mean, and then I just get exhausted because I'm like, I'm so tired of having to, and then I think you're all just making this up in your head. And then I'll be, like how much people are worried about this sort of thing, other people. But then I'll be scrolling on Facebook and I'll see someone I previously respected posts a post about how someone was pretending to be disabled or something. And then I'm like, oh God, it's too complicated. And then I'm
Yeah.
spazzing out, literally, like becoming more and more uncomfortable on public transport, falling over more and more. It's like I don't even, when you've put so much psychological energy into progressing beyond an initial stage, pushing inspirationally, pushing your boundaries, you then, there's a part of me that wants to just indulge in my disability and be like, I'm disabled, and that doesn't need to be fixed. I have pain that can be accepted. Then there's another part of me which knows how much benefit meditating, exercising, relaxing. And when you tell anyone about your disability who's not disabled, they automatically go into, have you tried this? Have you tried that? What about this? Do you do yoga? And I'm like, I see that benefit because I do that for myself. I do that process for myself. I'm always saying, you could be doing more, you could be stretching more. But like, it leads to these big existential questions of like, what is the purpose of having a body? Is it for constant self-improvement? How do you decide where you want to be with your body? How much do you emphasize constant optimization? How much is this a product of neoliberal late stage capitalism? Like what are the pluses of having a disabled? Because we were saying, my heightened sensitivity is a superpower too. Like I genuinely think that I am sensitive to I'm responsive to certain kinds of therapy that other people might be dismissive of. Energy healing is very effective on me, because I I don't experience, there are times where I feel like my body's a big, heavy, immobile lump. But then at other times, I'm so sensitive that I feel like I'm feeling things well beyond the boundaries of my physical body in a way that I don't think everyone does. Um, I'm not saying everyone with CP is psychic or whatever, or hears or feels ghosts, but I do think that, I mean, it would be interesting to actually do a do some kind of study on that.
Which is a good segue into one of the questions about the room. However, I do want to give you the opportunity to go back. You said that there was a potential can of worms. You don't have to talk about it, of course, but if you wanted to, you said in terms of um, sort of a very early developmental stage and your awareness of CP, it seems like there was some kind of emotional can of worms that you were referencing.
I can't remember what I was talking about specifically there, having mentioned so many things. My God. Um, uh, I don't remember exactly what I said was a can of worms now. I think I said most of what I wanted to go back to, though. I said I wanted to go back to this idea that CP has a strange relationship with childhood. Um, uh, because so many adults with CP feel completely invisible and completely
Mm,
abandoned in terms of care. No one can even tell me there's no research on life expectancy in CP. As
mm,
far as I know, it doesn't necessarily impact life expectancy, but maybe it does. I don't know.
yeah.
Almost no research exists on what the experiences psychologically and physically are of
Mm,
people getting older with CP. And every time I attempt to, as I've told you about this, like as an adult, when I've gone independently to try to get referred to physios or to get help, like no one can do it. And I've had really bad experiences in the medical system, people who are clueless, because everyone who knows about CP is a pediatric specialist. So you then go to a GP or you go to a neurologist, and you get just passed around like a hot potato, and people are like,
mm,
I've never treated anyone with CP who's an adult or wherever before because they're not a pediatric specialist. Then you talk to the pediatric specialists and they say, well, I don't have any adult patients because they're all
yeah.
just off doing their own thing and no one has any information. um, and so all of the problems of adulthood, like especially this is something that I take a great interest in, is sexuality. Children are desexualized generally, societally. And then, but yours, as with CP, you're being touched all the time from birth. The way you understand embodiment and sensuality and care, you're being so touched in a medicalized frame, and
Yeah.
then no one wants to talk about the fact that you're a responsive, sensual body that experiences pleasure or has difficulties with pleasure. And then, I mean, there is more research now on sexuality and CP, and um,
But
but yeah, I mean, I
never mind
think
just the psychological experience of being presented, often naked, in front of adults in varying
yeah,
ages of development, and
yeah.
the psychosexual responses or sort of elements that carry through into adulthood and what that means, and it's not to pathologize any of it, but it's also just, I think the not speaking about it is the pathology. I think that is the sort of the shame inducing element of anything really.
And I've got a lot better at explaining to like sexual partners or, yeah, about my body and its reactions and what feels good or doesn't feel good. But like by and large, most people just feel really uncertain of how to operate. There isn't much conversation generally about. We're always expected with sex and touch, non-sexual touch, to just know what works and know how another person's body works, nervous system is, but we don't until we ask, with or without disability. Um, yeah, and uh, so things are changing, and mostly because of advocates, CP advocates, pointing out these gaps. In terms of childhood, another thing that's very interesting is like I personally feel that the experience of CP can be described as like premature aging, premature adulthood. In some ways, you're infantilized because you're a medical subject throughout your life. But in other ways, it's like, let's imagine I did have a stroke in the womb. I had something that usually happens to people much later in life, not always, but I'm now also like the idea of having palsied limbs is very much associated with age and strokes. Um, the idea of having sort of light, brittle bones that, being prone to falling, having weak muscles, losing muscle, having, osteoporosis and sort of just generally low muscle tone, stiffness, mobility issues, chronic pain. Also, later in life, there's often an increased susceptibility to like anxiety, overthinking, nervous tension, nervous exhaustion, psychosis, like dementia. There's this kind of profile that you find with CP of like nervousness and that higher kind of nervous activation, like um, even conditions that are also parallel to CP, like I, since puberty, have had chronic, essentially probably incurable seborrheic dermatitis of varying levels of aggravation. And that is actually directly linked to the nervous damage in CP. I more recently discovered people who develop neuron damage develop seborrheic dermatitis. People develop it later in life develop seborrheic dermatitis. And so there is an autoimmune component that there's a feeling I have that I'm experiencing old age, that I've been experiencing old age since birth. Um, so that's an interesting thing to think
Mm.
about. Also, people with CP, for whatever reason, they tend to not only not have intellectual impairment as part of the condition, because it's not that part of the brain that's affected, they also tend to be of above average intelligence, I have found. I don't know how to measure intelligence. I mean, far from me to talk like that, but they don't seem to be dumb. They tend to be people who are very hyper aware, very capable of deconstructing situations. They often develop very high levels of education, in my experience, tend to be very good observers of society. Perhaps being marginalized and disabled gives you this sensitivity, these insights. I don't know. But it's funny that people then are so underestimated in the early parts of their life. They're so infantilized and underestimated by others. And then so they've been like these clever, wise little creatures trapped in the bodies of frail, ailing, old people. Because they're
Mm.
also the treatment you get with CP is similar to how we tend to treat societally the elderly, the frail. It's just like, well, you're kind of fucked up. It's just the nature of your condition. We'll
Mm.
try to provide you care, but you're never going to get better. And we
Mm.
don't expect to see disabled people behaving like able-bodied people, just like we don't really expect to see the elderly. If you're behaving not like an old person, then you're not old yet. You know what I mean? um, there's very much this, just like we desexualize the elderly, we desexualize the physically disabled. Very,
Mm.
to me, there's a lot of similarity.
Mm.
It's difficult for me to countenance or imagine being old. In some ways, it's really easy, but aging is tricky for me because I always felt like I wasn't even meant to survive the first hours of birth. I always felt like I wasn't going to live long. No one told me how long my life expectancy was. No one spoke to me about later in life aspirations. It was always about how do we get you functional. They didn't really ask like what do you they don't ask you questions like who do when you're disabled in a wheelchair. People don't say like who do you want to date? Um, you know, what's your marriage gonna be like? What are your kids gonna be like? Because they're not assuming any of that stuff's gonna happen or that you even want that.
Mm.
Um, And then if they are assuming that stuff, they often project their own versions of it onto you. So, for example, I went to school with somebody who I have since discovered that they are queer. And they, at our school, they had very severe CP and a variety of other conditions. And they were so disabled that they couldn't really, move independently. And I watched in school as our Christian, cisgendered, straight carers projected heterosexuality onto this person and onto me. Would say things like, "Oh, is this your little girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever?" And it's like, so I'm like, if you're even going to allow us the capacities or the desires of the able-bodied, if that even happens, then you project your own version of it. It's like no one ever imagined that any of us disabled kids would not only be disabled, but we'd have romantic or sexual desires, and that they might not be heteronormative. I don't know anybody who can't think of any instance where an adult around me ever imagined that,
Mm.
um, or articulated that. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about what childhood means for somebody with CP.
Yeah.
Um, it is a weird mix. It's a weird blend of things.
Mm.
And the internal parent, if you want to get psychological, like we've talked about this through psychotherapy, I've realized more recently that I have a very present, very well developed part or in part of myself which I at one point took to calling like my demon lover because it felt so intertwined with my nervous system and so sort of present and sort of claustrophobically there. And it was that part of me that I must have developed before I was verbal, pre-verbal
Mm.
as a baby, that basically said like, stay within these limits.
Mm.
Don't push yourself too far beyond these limits because you'll fall over, you'll experience pain. And I can identify that inner part of myself that is saying and doing, sending. This is the thing I was thinking about in the shower today. This was my shower thought before this we started talking. I was like, how would I characterize my CP? And I said, well, there's this very physical, undeniable nervous system activation at all times. And
Mm-hmm.
then I started thinking, is that true? Because I know how to turn it off. I can use the power of my mind and breath to switch it off. And then as I thought that, I moved my foot and I slipped on some in the shower and I slipped on some uh, conditioner that was on like a film of conditioner I just washed off my
Yeah.
hair, and I slipped and I spasmed and almost fell over, and
Mm.
the voice inside was like, "Oh!" Then I started thinking, who did that? What did I? Was that like a rejoinder from that inner part of me that was like, no, you can't just switch it off. You have to be careful. I have an internal crossing guard that is very
Mm.
loving and protective of me, but why I'm bringing this up is because that internal parenting, if you want to call it that, or
Mm-hmm.
caretaker, the way it expresses itself internally is quite monstrous. So I'll explain. And now I only have one other person with CP who's also queer, who's also an occultist, who I've talked to about this, and he has said, oh yes, I have that too. So it's a sample of two. So maybe if anyone listens to this, maybe there'll be a bigger sample. But I have this thing that I only really realized in the last like 2 years that I have, where it's like I have quite a horrifying internal landscape. Like
Yeah.
there is always a part of me that is showing me really gruesome imagery. And I just thought it was my like personality. I'd never really made a connection between CP because I'm a Scorpio moon in the 12th house for astrology aficionados. I have Saturn in the first house too. So I tend to have quite a gothic, morbid, like I love watching horror movies. My psyche is very captivated by images. I feel a strong impulse to consume quite a lot of horrifying media. I watch a lot of documentaries about cults. I watch a lot of horror, not because I enjoy it, but because I do experience my inner landscape as quite monstrous. And of course there is so many ways you could psychoanalyze this. On I think quite a boring level, you could say, well, I often have a very negative view of my body. I see my body as mutinous, like I mentioned. It doesn't always do what I want it to do. It's unpredictable. And so I have demonized my body. But I think
Yeah.
that's a very
Yeah,
lame interpretation.
I think, I mean, look, someone with pure O would immediately understand the realm that you're describing, the
Mhm.
incessant sort of deluge of horrifying images or thoughts that just
Intrusive.
so intrusive. And anyone with pure O, would they wouldn't bat an eyelid. They wouldn't think, oh, you're going to do any of these things, or like they would completely understand.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is that my feelings on CBT, but my a psychotherapeutic stance, a depth psychology stance of that, and probably what you're describing, is that there is ultimately some inherent lack of self-worth that was formed at a very young age, that sort of crystallized in the psyche, and some part of the psyche is trying to look for evidence, is trying to sort of project out these sort of macabre, dangerous, uh, horrifying images as a way to try and grapple with this primitive. It's not primitive, but it's just so early in the development of the child's psyche that there is this sense of lack of worth, of lack of belonging, and
I
psychotherapists
think
will argue as to why that develops.
I
Yeah.
think that's there. I do. But then part of what I wanted to highlight was that it's the more defensive mechanism. Like I didn't realize how much it's just kind of always playing in
Mm.
some area of my
Like a radio
awareness.
station
But
always on.
yeah, there's like in those moments where I push myself emotionally or physically beyond the comfortable limits, what I see internally, visually, is images of imminent, just like monstrous destruction, horrifying destruction. I see my skull being smashed with a hammer. I see bugs and maggots exploding out of parts of my body. I see myself being chopped up and like and this is so constant and normal that I like it's like very hyperbolic. I see like it feels like the whole world is going to because one of the things is that when you have so much spastic tension all the time and it feels like you're going to be destabilized, that moment of release feels like totally annihilating, because you're holding on so much. You sometimes see like when people are like just so tight and so anxious, and then they're like, I can't, if I let go, if I release, I'll be, what, like my boundaries will be so dissolved. And, and then it's like this demon lover, crossing guard, protector, parenting self. It goes like, don't do that because if you do, you'll just and so I think that's also woven into self-image, self-love ideas about the body being monstrous, the body not doing what it's supposed to, the body not even really
Mhm.
like belonging to oneself. And
Mm.
then there's also a more interesting positive side to that because I've had enough experiences now to know that when on the other side of that spastic release, is not annihilation. um, Sometimes the spastic release is really exhilarating and blissful too. Like I've always felt that my body has a very strong capacity for pleasure, for as well as pain. Like the obverse side of that is a great deal of sensitization. Just as one can be really stiff and like the expansive release is equally vast. And
Mm.
I've always had a sense that like my self-image has always been slightly, well, not slightly, very monstrous. Um, I've always felt like I'm something that has too many limbs or tentacles or heads, and to fit into this body. That that the amount of energy that's flowing through my nervous system or energy body or however you want to conceive it clearly cannot fit into this conventional meat puppet form that everybody else is apparently taking seriously. I've never really felt like my subtle body conforms to the boundaries of my physical body, or that
Mm.
it's really in actually human. Now, I don't know. It's impossible for me to say whether that's because of me, my soul, or personality, or childhood trauma, or CP. Like, I can't disentangle. Or
Yeah.
is it my sexuality? Is it being queer? Because queer people love horror and demons, and because we are the like the shadow of heteronormativity. We're the societal scapegoat. We're the demon. We're demonic, for so many people, in society. So it's like, there's so many factors in my life that tend towards this self monstrification. Um, but it's just interesting to articulate, like, body horror is so much the baseline of my internal conversation that I have with myself in my dream landscape, in my felt experience. Like, I mean, I don't even know if I want to do it as an experiment, but if I had to journal all the discrete moments in my day where I experience, maybe everybody has this. I always assumed that everybody did, but I'm starting to think they don't. But if I had to journal all the times in the course of my day that I like have a very vivid, intense, horrifying thought about something repulsive and disgusting happening to my body, or seeing myself rot or decay or being ripped apart or eaten or dissolved or like, it's a horror movie 24/7 in my mind, but
Mm.
I'm not disturbed by it. It doesn't worry me. I don't experience it as obsessive, compulsive, intrusive, terrifying thoughts. I'm just like, oh yeah, the landscape of my psyche is very scorpionic. It's very gothic. It's very dark. I like I it's there, and there's also a certain pleasure to it. I mean, it can also be quite terrifying if I'm in an altered state, like dreaming or having an extreme spiritual experience or whatever. It's very dark, but it's like it's the Adams family. It's like that's also home
Mm.
for me.
Mm.
So I don't find that kind of slightly, what's the word, like morbid kind of um, decaying, monstrous death. Like, I don't find that it's very comfortable for me, but it doesn't worry me that, like, I go to the hairdresser. I mean, I know this is probably something that people with compulsive thoughts or obsessive thoughts experience too. Like, I had it at the hairdresser. I went to the hairdresser 2 days ago, and of course, when he's like, just hold still. He's got the scissors there, and I'm like, the slightest CP spasm. Like, I didn't mention actually when I had the spasm with that conversation with my mom. I actually spilt coffee all over myself and the wall. It was mostly I had the spasm, and then I started thinking, don't spill the coffee. And then because people see this sometimes with me, I'll be sitting at the chair, I'll be talking, and then I'll spill my coffee everywhere. Because I'll jump, and they'll be like, what? Jesus, what happened? Or I'll like
Mm.
fall suddenly, grab something, and they're like, what the hell? And I'm like, I had a spasm. You don't see me spasming, but I had a spasm. But the spasm was caused by me reacting to the thought. Um,
Mm.
so I almost spilt my coffee all over my keyboard. It was almost a disaster in terms of destroying my new laptop. But at the hairdresser, I just kept thinking, like, oh my God, like, and then he could just, if I, all I would have to do is, and now I know that people without CP have these thoughts too, could just be stabbed in the jugular. But then I felt my body starting to spaz out, and I felt myself starting to have little spasms in my leg, and I know how to control those cells. I can separate the lower body from the upper body so that those spasms don't radiate. But I then started saying, "Come on, you also know how to breathe and regulate this. You know how to do this. Like, But it is crazy because it wasn't just that thought. It was then how much I was luxuriating in an internal visionary experience of imagining the blood everywhere. And then what would it be like? Then I started imagining all my skin being peeled off. And this is just very normal for me. But I think that if I had to explain this to some people, they would be like, I have never had such a extended scene of
Mm.
body horror, except in my worst nightmares, which I can probably count like two of them in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those people are probably not watching David Lynch movies, or, I think that there is something of like the freak mind that kind of like understands that there is like weirdly like a pacifying quality to these thoughts, that they can
Hmm.
be weirdly soothing.
I'm going to show
And
you the worst thing, the worst
yeah,
outcome, and
yeah,
there's still consciousness
mm-hmm,
beyond it. Like you can
yeah,
visualize the mind can imagine its egoic death, the visualization of the idea of the self, but the
mm-hmm,
mind remains.
yeah.
Consciousness remains.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, do you want to talk about the room? Because that's one of the questions. And then I've got one, I've, s- we've touched on basically all of the questions anyway, except the final one. And then if you want to talk about the room, we can talk about the room.
People are going to think you mean that terrible movie. Hi, Mark. Um, but
I mean, we
w-
can talk about that as well.
the reference here is to I was previously explaining how in having in the past couple of years I've neglected my body by not having a regular. I'm getting better at doing regular exercise, stretching, strength building. I
Mm-hmm.
had neglected my body, but I'd also been neglecting having a regular kind of spiritual meditation practice. Um, and I've always felt in touch with, capable of easily tuning into kind of like subtle realities, hearing the voices of non-human intelligence or other deeper parts of being. Or I've always felt very like it only takes a small calibration of my mind or body or energy to tune into stuff that's sort of pervasively around. It's not quite here, it's deep within and it's also beyond the body. So, what I was saying about the room was that for a long time I had been feeling like there are spiritual, and I'd also been avoiding having like a going to sleep mindfully. I don't entirely understand the psychology behind it, but I was like staying up late, reverse bedtime procrastinating, falling asleep with the lights on, like I was in a Freddy Krueger movie, afraid to go to sleep
I
because
have
I
to
knew
interrupt
that.
you. I have to interrupt you and say that you said something so funny the other day, which is that you were like, we were talking about the couch that you wanted to buy, and then you referred to your couch as the thing that you cheat, no, or your bed, you cheat on your bed with the couch every night because you continually fall asleep in the living room. Like you can't just go
I
to bed.
mean, I cultivated this bad habit, but as a joke, I was saying also in spending a lot of time buying a new sofa for the new apartment, I had said to friends like, because some people are very utilitarian about sofas, and I'm like, I can. This is something we didn't quite touch on, but one of my cerebral palsy superpowers is that I can also sit for long periods of time without moving. I mean, I experience quite a lot of pain just generally, but I
Mm,
can really dissociate from my body very easily.
mm,
Maybe
mm,
that's a learned mechanism. Maybe that's the inevitable thing that happens to a child whose life begins in an incubator, being fed, being blindfolded and fed. I'm sure I learned how to astrally project then, or
yeah,
go deep within the body. I don't know. But
yeah,
I said to a friend, no, I need a sofa that has a certain amount of comfort. I'm going to be doing a lot of lying and schlumping on it. And, I want the sofa to be so comfortable that I start to question my monogamy to my mattress. I want the sofa to be like my mistress, you know. Um, uh, I want to feel like I'm in imminent danger of cheating on bed with the sofa. And because I have been doing that lately. But anyway, with the room analogy, it was just how I felt in terms of like having not tuned into spiritual realities for a long time. Like it's like I knew that they were
Mm.
there in another realm of reality. It was like there was I was talking more or less in terms of my CP and more in terms of how contact with spirits feels to me, spirit guides or ancestral guides, or it was like they were throwing a house party and I was the guest of honor because it was within my own consciousness, my own energy system. It was housed within my own house, but I was refusing to go into the room. I was just sort of hearing the music from outside, but refusing to come inside for some reason, avoiding. And there's a certain ease with which one can do that if you're familiar with those, the feeling, the movement of energy.
Mm. Which
Um,
I'm going to take your pause there and just going to quickly jump in and say that it's interesting because when you told me that the first time, I completely thought that you were talking about CP, and like we've since uncovered that there was a misunderstanding, but it's fascinating to me because it just sort of at no point did I think that you weren't talking about CP, that there was this room that you could go into if you wanted to. Like it's like there was this like there was a physical reality that you could have if you went into this room, but you just could not get into that room. And then later
mm,
we sort of realized, oh no, you weren't actually talking about CP, you were talking about like a more sort of psycho-spiritual part of your life. So
mhm.
it's it's just interesting to me how as somebody who doesn't have CP, who's always trying to understand what it's like for you in your brain, that just matched perfectly into what I assumed it was like to have CP. Like I didn't question it in the same way with that gap metaphor that we spoke about yesterday.
Well, can
Um,
you articulate more, both in terms of that metaphor and then also like just in terms of your observations?
yeah,
Like, I'm curious, do you know when I'm in pain? Do you
I can
know when I'm
see
struggling? Can you see?
I can see emotionally when you get frustrated. That's much more obvious.
Hmm.
Um, I can see when you are concentrating. I assume that there is constant low level pain. That I've always assumed that that's sort of, you used the word ambient before. I think that my assumption is that there's always like there's a chronic nature to the pain. Um, and then the gap metaphor that I use that you could, so we were talking about this interview yesterday, and I shared that, in my mind, I kind of think of the CP as like, is there a gap? And it's like you're trying to, it's like the relationship between your brain and your muscle responses. And sometimes that gap is wider or shorter. And when you're like, when maybe with it, whether it's certain movements or whatever, then the gap is wider and then it takes longer or it's more difficult or less successful to try and like enact the movement that you want. And you said to me, no, not at all. That there is no gap. That is the wrong metaphor. That's not at all how you see it. That's not how at all how I experience it. Uh, and that in fact, if anything, it's like there is no gap. In fact, there's almost a claustrophobia in terms of just jumbled wires and everything's on top of each other. If anything, it's about trying to sort of make more space between the movements or the sensory uh, information that's coming in.
Yeah, I would say that's about right. The gap didn't really resonate with me. I guess there is a way in which maybe there's something like that happening. Like I think about when I went to the gym in Cape Town a couple of times with our mutual friend Steven, who used to be a dancer and choreographer and knows about the body, knows how to direct movement, and he was a very good guide in pushing me to beyond certain limits and encouraging me and showing me how to use certain machines. And he had some interesting observations. Literally, he was observing me in trying to do certain movements, and there were two instances that kind of encapsulated this. One was, what do you call that in the gym where you pull yourself up, pull up bars or whatever?
Sure. Immediately I'm laughing because I have no idea.
So I was hanging from the bars and he was encouraging me to pull my knees up to my chest,
Yeah.
and do a certain number of repetitions. Now, huh,
That sounds so hard. That sounds so hard.
well, the thing is, my upper body is quite strong. My abdominals are quite strong because I have strengthened it and it works fairly well and I use it. But, the biggest problem I have is that I often feel neurologically
Mm,
like, and I think this is neurologically true, I feel like everything below the waist and everything above the waist is not in sync. Um, I feel like when I'm not exercising, when I'm not dancing, when I'm not stretching, when I'm not meditating, it really does feel like it's two different toys. Like the leg and the top, they're not the same. Just been put together and they very rarely. So there is a gap, there is a disconnection there. And I know that a certain intervention, like massage or yoga or breathing or whatever, is working because it doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels
mm,
like there is a coordination between the upper and the lower body. And exercises that encourage coordination between the upper and lower body are really good for me because I find that I don't get as much benefit from just doing targeted exercises in the lower body and the upper body separately. There's something about the neurological the ease with which that communication and coordination can happen. It feels very enriching. I feel very juicy and full as opposed to very blocked and disconnected when those neural pathways or whatever it is happen. And in extreme cases of physical neglect, it has reached a point where areas of the body, especially below the waist, just begin to feel not even in my body. I begin to feel like really disconnected. The best analogy for it is that I feel like when you have a drop down list when you have to fill out a questionnaire online, and then you can see certain options are available, but they're grayed out. And you're like, no, that's the option I need. I need that box. Why is it grayed out? Who grayed it out? So I know it's there, but it's now grayed out. And it's a little bit of a challenge to make that option available. So I see that in terms of the range of movements. It's like I know there's a capacity, but my body, like I said, my nervous system is very responsive because I lean so much on these compensations and these easy neurological path between A and B. With time, you start to forget that there's other ways you can move your body. You
mm,
become very formulaic, and so there's a great joy and a great need to ungray those options. But it
mm.
can feel a little bit hard at first. So with Steve, he was telling me you can do it, you can lift it, and I was like, Stephen, no, you don't understand all the mental energy that's being exerted in keeping these muscles activated a certain way in the upper body, it just feels like I can't, feels like I'm paralyzed. Feels like I'm mentally saying, like, move your leg. And my body will just be like, no, the leg cannot move. But then I have to relax and I have to be like, no, there are these pathways available. I relax and then I go, no, you can move. You can do these two movements at the same time. And then I'm like, I do it. It feels like I just had to die. Like in my mind, I'm seeing a sped up version of asteroids and the dinosaurs dying and the corpses becoming flowers and the flowers dying. And, like I see this hyperbolic thing where I'm like, I've had to undergo so many mini deaths just to get to this point where I ungrade that box. And then I'm like, oh my God. And then it feels so wonderful because I'm like, wow, that capacity of the nervous system is there.
Yeah.
And Steven said he had to laugh because he was watching my face. He was like, it looked like you were defusing a bomb. It looked like you were just because I was like, Steven, you don't understand. It's like I know that I can do this. I know it's as simple as just lifting my knee up, but it's like my brain is saying there is no pathway. There is no way that can be done.
I
And
think that's what I think of as the gap. I think that's
right.
where I'm
But I
perceiving
don't
it.
experience it as a gap because I experience instead an intensification of noise. I
Mm,
feel so much going on in that space. And there's, like I said, the internal vision of it is that there's so much happening. There's so many voices. There's so many contradictory. There's so much. It doesn't feel like I'm struggling to jump across a gulf or a gap. There is a gap, but when you first explained gap, it felt like I was struggling to, like there was something that I could. The idea of a gap felt empty somehow, but it's not empty. It's full. It's
yeah.
not. It's there's so much happening and it's grayed out. It's not that I can't. It's not
Mm,
that it's not that there isn't a part of me that knows that it's there. It just
mm.
sort of feels inaccessible. It
It's
can
just
be because I
everything's
also
too
know that
loud,
I've
too
probably
much.
used it before. So
Yeah.
like there's a certain amount of overthinking that is happening. That's why a little bit of alcohol historically has allowed me to be more coordinated to a point because
Mm,
it like stops that noise, that over anticipatory reflex. And then the
mm,
next thing I did with Stephen was he taught me how to jump, how to do a box jump, how to go from being on the ground to jumping onto the edge of a box. And I was like, Stephen, I will never be able to do that. I can barely stand up straight. And he was like, let me explain to you the individual movements. And then it felt so like artificial because he was like, all you have to do now is like just, because I was like, Stephen, I don't know how to activate. I don't know. How do you're just saying jump, but like my brain is just like, no, it's not an option. But then when he broke down all those things and I just told myself there's a part of your body that knows how to do that, then I was able to do multiple box jumps. I think the problem now is that if I tried to do it again, I'd be starting from scratch again. I'd have to show myself. It's like you
mm,
gain and you lose so quickly, you know?
mm.
So there is this like gap in that sense. It's just something about the image of the gap felt like I had to throw myself over a precipice that was like empty and void, but it's not. There's so much noise. There's so much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, hang on, we've gotten slightly digressed from the room, but right, because I was saying it's it's fascinating to me that yeah, that I just completely thought that you were talking about CP about the whole time. But you were saying that you actually think that some of this is a result potentially of CP.
How would I could never disentangle those two things. Like
Yeah.
I would just have to talk to more diviners and mediums and more people with CP who didn't have any interest in those things,
Yeah.
and I'd have to compare. I mean, I also think the body horror I was talking about that I associate with CP is also because you're so accustomed to worrying about falling over that you imagine all the dangerous things that could happen if you. There's a certain amount of not trusting your body. That's what I mean. When you're a little bit, your body does things automatically that you can't believe, but then it often feels like I have to get out of my own way. I really do have to, because, like I said, a lot of my unconscious processes feel conscious. It's like I'm
Mm.
hearing things that are meant to be backstage that I'm not meant to be hearing. Like I literally feel like I hear a voice saying, like, fill up bladder, like I feel like I hear those things that other people don't hear. I don't know how to explain
Mm.
that. But what that often means is that I do sort of short circuit myself. So in situations where you're just meant to relax and the body is just meant to do its normal reactions, I'm
Mm.
very much in my own way, you know.
Do you
Um,
find it irritating or interesting when able-bodied people hear something that you like an experience that you have or something, they go, "Oh, I have something like that too." And then
I find it irritating and interesting because I don't want them to be so certain that it is the same. But I also think that it's true that a lot of things I'm talking about are the same. It's just more like I
it's
was
just
talking to a
impossible
friend of
to really
mine.
know, yeah, where the line
You
is.
could you could never know. But I
Yeah.
was talking to a friend of mine, Ed, who has a son with CP, and he's a traditional Chinese doctor and has a lot of medical knowledge and has treated his son in conventional and alternative medical ways. And he was saying his son experiences very similar things. Like it's that he believes that what I had articulated, what I'm trying to say here, is something that a lot of people don't understand about CP.
Mm,
That 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 there's so much awareness all the time of the signaling of the that is usually unconscious and automatic for a lot of people, and that combined with the constant tension is exhausting.
mm,
Um, there's a kind of hyperactivation and
yeah.
hyper nervous activation, and so all the more reason to like learn how to relax. You know,
Well,
like I was just gonna say, I think that I'm so interested in having had experiences of spirit possession and the feeling of things taking over that are not like you, they're not consciously you. One interest in unconscious forces, like I mean, with CP, it's very rare that you feel like anything just happens in your body automatically, except pain and dysfunction.
mm,
And you're so aware of how your own mental inner noise and talking influences, for better or worse,
mm,
your ability to do a simple task like walk good or or like or not lose balance. You're so aware of how that helps and hinders.
mm,
So when I get into spaces where things just flow, like as a kid with CP, I loved to dance, so much so that it became a problem. The carers and teachers of the special needs school said, "We know Ben is very proud of his new underpants or whatever he meant underpants, but could you please encourage him to stop dancing on the table in his underpants?" It's like because now all the kids who are more disabled, he's telling them they have to also dance, and this is it's a little problematic. They could harm themselves. And I don't know if I danced well, but I love to dance. I love the idea of allowing the rhythms of my body to take over. Um, but at the same time, you feel with CP that it's so difficult to do that because you keep coming up against your limits and you're so
mm,
stiff. But you also I have such a sense of how much the flow of energy and the rhythms of the body are bigger than just they have their own natural pulsation.
yeah.
They there's so much pleasure in that too. And I think again, I'm talking about things that probably everybody experiences, but I I come into it from my own angle.
Yeah. That's a good segue into the final question, which is around Yoga Nidra. And if so the if I am tasked, well, I've tasked myself with this, to make a Yoga Nidra for people with CP so that they can mitigate some of the physical tension in their body. Um, what what would you say if I ask you the question, like, what do you think the perfect yoga nidra or active imagination or hypnosis kind of uh what do you think would be the best sort of walkthrough or best approach, or like what if you could order in from the ultimate CP yoga nidra, what do you think it would look like? What do you think we should focus on? My assumption is the nervous system. Is that because of, I mean, this, it's been so amazing. Let me actually pause here and just say, it's been so amazing having these conversations with you about having this interview, because even though we've had so many conversations before about CP, it's there's something that really amazing happens when you're sitting down and saying, like, we are discussing this thing about you. And it's different to just casually entering conversation, because then it also casually exits the conversation, as opposed to like literally what we're doing in just going, this is the conversation, and we're going to explore as much of it as we can. And in that, we've unearthed this thing that is so helpful for me to understand your brain and your experience of life, which is that you've really impressed upon me now, the noise, the loudness, the overstimulation, the like multiple wires, and it's all jumbled up, and the processing that's going into everything, and the dexterity that you have developed in picking apart all the different signals and what they mean in a way that can help you literally just get through a day or a minute even, especially when all of a sudden there's like multiple external sensory influences, never mind all the internal ones as well. So I say that because it's been really helpful, because it's kind of put me into this place of thinking about the nervous system differently. And I sort of uh, started saying this earlier, which is that, if somebody is not capable of spending enough time in rest and digest, of course they're going to be constipated. Of course they're going to have physical tension, and then ultimately always mental tension as well, where there is a not enough time spent just in a state of recline, of like energetic nervous recline. um and so my assumptions would be that it's got to be something around doing that, around really helping to like reduce all sensory input and allowing the body to just settle into a deep state of relaxation. Am I right? Is there more? Feel free to correct me in any way. Yeah.
Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, you know already that I have a lot of history of exploring things like self-hypnosis, inducing trance states. Um, what I've realized more recently is I used to do deep relaxation practices as a preamble to meditation, ritual work. And I never really thought about that. I did that because it primed my nervous system, body, brain, energy body, whatever, to do these other spiritual practices. But now that I'm not doing them as often, I realize that it had so much benefit for my CP. Um, Unsurprisingly. So number one, absolutely, like any form of like deep relaxation through practices like Yoga Nidra, hypnosis, I can't imagine that not being a benefit to anyone and everyone with CP. Um, Beyond that, I would probably add like maybe two other points. One is because of what we spoke about this feeling of always being overstimulated and uncertain, unsteady, untrusting of the body. Because regardless of what type of CP you have, you or where the affliction is, how it expresses itself, I think everyone with CP has the experience of wanting to present themselves a certain way physically in the world, communicate with their body, communicate with their voice, be seen a certain way, and not being able to, you know, being blocked and having to expend a huge amount of energy. So that's tiring and exhausting. So the rest and nourishment is there. But then I think also the sending of like love and appreciation to the nervous system. Because it's very easy to say like, oh, my body's against me. And there are days where I really do feel like I'm just frustrated and I'm dragging my body along. But I also love my twitchy, spastic body. Um, it provides me so many opportunities to feel and sense. And it needs a lot more rest and recuperation than I tend to give it. Because like we were talking about, the hyperstimulation gets you momentum. Because
Mm.
often the biggest thing I struggle with in my life right now that I'm trying to sort of process is I find it very difficult to go from neutral, to use a driving metaphor, which means nothing to me because I can't drive and never will, but hate cars. But I find it very difficult to go from neutral to, like, we've talked about this a lot. My biggest issue now is I'm not afraid of socializing. I enjoy the stimulation, but I do have this social anxiety where I get stuck in the house. And it's very difficult for me to go from real relaxation, or maybe it's not relaxation, because I think this is the challenge I have. I know how to sit still, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm relaxed. Stasis is not the same as relaxation. So this is something that I'm realizing, like, even when I'm relaxed, a lot of my friends tell me this. They're like, especially my friends in Asian medical traditions, they're like, you're so strange to me because we can have coffee and you're exhibiting all the signs of someone who has severe wind disorder, like
Vata
you you're
or
you're
lung.
hyper verbose, you're very nervy. I can feel your nervous, the amount of wind that's in this conversation, but you don't seem manic. You
And
seem
just
very clear and stable. I
anyone without any knowledge of these things, a wind disorder is not a gastrointestinal disorder that Ben is talking about. He's talking about
It's a
like
wind humor.
wind humor, so vata or lung. I don't know what it would be called in CTM, but lung
Slightly
in
different categories, yeah.
Tibetan traditional medicine and vata in Ayurveda. Yeah. Sorry, please continue.
They'll say, but you also seem focused, and you're sitting in this chair and you're listening to me, and
Mm,
they're like, it's weird to me. There's this mismatch. And so I also am trying to understand what that means. Like, I genuinely believe that, like, deep relaxation is at the basis. Like, deep relaxation on an existential level, not just like relax your muscles, get a good night's sleep, but like what does it mean to truly relax into reality? Like for me,
mm,
I'm very interested in that. Again, for obvious reasons, the immediate benefits are there, but like when I've had so many other similar subtle treatments, like about my experience with more recently with craniosacral therapy, one thing that came out of there is that there are parts of my body, especially around the pelvis and the legs, which
mm,
are so consistently maintaining spastic tension
mm,
with a kind of innate intelligence that they are holding me together. They are keeping me upright and holding me emotionally and physically together.
mm,
That even when I do deep relaxation, there are levels of spastic tension in the nervous system that are really hard to get to. And to let them go, it can only happen if I feel like I am held, to use a kind of new age way of explaining it. But the only way that self-protective, there are parts of my nervous system that are literally have been fighting for their lives since I was born, keeping me together, because I can't guarantee that I will literally hold myself together if I don't maintain a certain baseline level of spastic tension. And it,
mm,
it takes a lot to feel safe enough
mm.
to 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 let that go. There, even when I am in deep sleep, those
Yeah.
programs are still running. So any yoga nidra sort of intervention is probably going to want to emphasize that feeling of appreciation for the nervous system, but also encouraging it to know. Like, I believe that with CP, then the nerves are doing such a protective function. There's so much intelligence in the nervous system. It's amazing. But to really like let its organic intelligence operate and to really let go at the same time and to step out of the way of that process is like a
Mm.
really big thing.
Well,
So automation is an interesting thing. Spontaneity. It's hard for me to allow true, deep, open spontaneousness. And so anything that allows for that. And then also the other point I was going to say is like, so deep relaxation, profound relaxation, allowing oneself to be held in a bigger scheme than beyond that, the space of that nervous tension, that nervous, those holding patterns. And then whenever I do experience that deeply, truly, rather than feeling a sense of weakness and loss, because often the holding is like, no, you're together, you're strong, or dissipation. What I find is that there's a feeling of fullness and nourishment and juiciness, and so again, it's kind of directing in that direction, emphasizing that direction, like that that the relaxing, that the opening, that the softening is not a kind of loss of focus or clarity or vitality, but it's
Yeah.
because often when you release this nervous tension, you get this spastic response, and then there's often like weakness and coldness in its aftermath. A feeling of being like lighter, but also like weaker. But that's not true when that deep relaxation and recuperation happens. I know it's not true, but I would want to almost like suggest and remind in that direction that
Warmth
this is you're
and
getting more. Yeah, you're being nourished by this letting go.
yeah.
Not You're not going to lose something or be vulnerable. You know.
Yeah. That's really cool. Like that's such a key thing, and it just proves it, like, everything always is consistently proving this, that lived experience is always the best thing, because I could never imagine these things. I could never know that that would be a response that you are likely to have, and very possibly other people with CPU are likely to have that kind of that that perception of weakness and coldness as a result of release. When it's like coming from, like a really good and sort of space of relaxation. And it's interesting because I also think that when it comes to what you're describing, I mean, look, you're speaking my language in terms of, like, from a Yoga Nidra perspective, right? You said to sit still does not mean that you're relaxed, and of course it doesn't. I mean, I probably more people are more relaxed, I think, in general, if they're dancing and they're enjoying dancing. That's a result of being relaxed. It's like playfulness comes as a result of feeling safe with the people that you're around. If you're not very playful, it means you probably don't feel very safe around those people. And so it's like this looseness comes as a state of, like, internal relaxation. And often the rigidity or the sitting still is because that's often a sign of, like, internal tension, I would say, almost. And so, from Yoga Nidra perspective, it's, Yoga Nidra, well, I would say this. I can't speak for all Yoga Nidra teachers, but I would say we are so we're so capable of sitting and looking at a TV. What do they call it, like double screening now, where you're like on your phone and you're watching a movie kind of thing, and without moving. But that doesn't mean we're sitting with ourselves. That doesn't mean that we're sitting inside of ourselves, holding ourselves. And that's everything that I'm doing with Yoga Nidra, and that's the whole sort of mission statement of Afterglow, which is, just helping show people just how easy it is and how available, how accessible, it's universally accessible to just close our eyes or even keep our eyes open, but just sit with ourselves, just literally going inside and just sitting with ourselves and going like, hey, what's there? What's going on? And how wonderful it is. And so many people don't do it, sorry, out of fear or laziness, or it's probably those two. I don't know, there's probably other reasons, but I think that if we and this is like a universal thing. I think if we're just routinely creating an internal sort of safe space of relaxation inside, that is going to have much longer lasting effects than a massage or a lavender bath. Do you know what I mean? Like, those things just
Absolutely.
don't cut it. They just don't cut it. Or a cigarette, or a glass of wine. Like, these things they just barely scratch the surface, and often actually you'll end up inducing cortisol in the case of wine and cigarettes. And also in some cases, I think even in massage, touch can be an incredibly stressful thing. And then I know so many people who leave massages and they're like, that was terrible. I hate this. I hate people
Well, I
touching me.
increasingly am experiencing that because it just every time I get a massage, it shows me that what I really need is to treat in a very subtle way the tension in the nerves. Not it's the softening. I don't need the muscles to soften because the nerves are what are holding them in place. And
Yeah.
no amount of pummeling by massage can substitute for that. I just
Yeah.
wanted to also say what you said just now was amazing in Buddhist terms about finding that inner safety. This is what Buddhists call refuge. As a Buddhist, you take refuge only in the inner reality of your own consciousness and being, which is expressed externally as Buddha, the Buddhist teachings, and the community of practitioners. But the Buddha is not some external person or reality, it's your own nature. And increasingly I've been thinking about this a lot, like what is, because in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, especially, you go increasingly from external supports to inner subtle realities. So your refuge, your taking of refuge, your
Mm.
finding of security and safety becomes more directly internalized as with the sort of confidence and sophistication of your practice. So eventually you're taking refuge in like your indestructible energy, in the essential nature of your own consciousness. And so nothing external can ever destabilize you, and you're never seeking an end to suffering or help for things in these constantly shifting, changing outside circumstances. And if I could do something for anyone with CP, I would want to, in some other way, give them a bridge to discover trust and safety in their own nervous system, because the condition is a condition of defective nerves. So much so that the best intervention is to cut those nerves out. And yet, the the only way anyone survives or functions or triumphs through CP is also because of the power of the brain and the power of the nerves to be creative and flexible and to give life to the body. And it's like,
Yeah.
if I had an aspiration for anyone else with CP, I'm sure their experiences are overlapping but also very different from mine. It would just be like knowing that, because I feeling like your nervous system is against you, feeling like it's unpredictable, like even the most severely disabled people can learn to find a refuge inside their own body and inside their own nervous system. I genuinely believe that. Like, it might not be in the way that it is for able-bodied people, but I think that's all we're really left with. That's what's shaping our experience. So even that
Yeah.
expression, like that statement, like finding a safe space within your own nervous system, to me seems like that's our answer. That summarizes what the Yoga Nidra intervention would be for. And I believe there's an innate intelligence. Everyone with CP has different, their nervous system doing or spazzing out or noisy or defective
Yeah.
in different ways. But there's also a wisdom in that. I really think there is. There's also an intelligence in that. It's not a rule, but what's the alternative? Why would you choose to live a life where you don't resolve the opposites? You don't find deep meaning
Yeah.
and wisdom in your suffering. You could do that. Millions of people do it every day. But I don't see why I would choose that way of relating to my experience. Like, there has to be wisdom in this affliction, because
Mm.
the alternative is to just be afflicted and not get any wisdom. You know, why would I want that?
It was a how is there anything else you want to share? Is there anything else that you're thinking or feeling?
All I'm thinking is that actually it's really don't have more friends and acquaintances with CP, and that it would be interesting to hear about whether any of the things that I associate with my CP are, in fact, part of other people's experience. Because I think it's very common, like I said, like adults with CP get on with their own lives and they often don't spend a lot of time talking to other adults with CP. Um, and that's really sad. And there is such a lack of information. I am left wanting to know more about the internal worlds of people with CP.
Hmm.
So I certainly will I will share the end result with the few people I know who have it, and hopefully it will have a reach, you know. I just have no idea. Like,
Hmm. Yeah. How are you feeling now?
good, hungry.
Yeah.
I made this thing. I don't know how I feel about it. I've really been wanting to make it because I saw this Turkish German guy make it. It's like a Persian stew with aubergines, but it's
Mm.
got like ground walnuts, and then you and tomato paste and onions. It has no garlic. It has all ingredients are sweet though. It's got like cinnamon and turmeric. So I think it was meant to taste this way. I didn't have pomegranate molasses, so maybe I affected the taste too much using honey. It's very sweet. Like it's not bad, but it's
What is it called?
I can't remember.
'Cause I think I've had
Uh,
it. Oh, I've
it's
had
well, I
a
think
walnut Persian dish.
yeah, I think it's common. It's called shish andaz.
Oh no. Mm.
I mean, I think I could probably tweak it to be a little less sweet, but I think it's meant to be super sweet. Anyway,
Nice. Well, enjoy. Uh, Go feed yourself. I'm gonna go do the same. Thank you, Benny. I
my
appreciate
pleasure.
you.
Likewise.
Love you, and I hope you have a good Sunday.
Thank you. Love you. Talk to you soon.